Picture this. You're drifting off to sleep, but instead of counting sheep, you're sailing across storm-tossed seas alongside some of history's most legendary warriors. Tonight, we're embarking on an epic journey through 3 centuries of Viking history, where every raid, every conquest, and every distant shore discovered will guide you into peaceful slumber. The story we're about to unfold spans from 793 to 1066, covering the complete saga of the Viking Age. We'll witness the first terrifying raids that sent shockwaves across medieval Europe, follow intrepid explorers as they discovered new worlds, and experience the gradual transformation of fierce pagan warriors into Christian kingdoms. This isn't just another history lesson. This is the entire Viking Age, told as one continuous narrative designed to carry you through the night. But before we set sail from the fjords of Scandinavia, let me paint you a picture of what made this era so extraordinary. The Vikings weren't simply bloodthirsty raiders as Hollywood might have you believe. They were master shipbuilders, whose vessels could navigate both open oceans and shallow rivers. They were shrewd traders who established commercial networks stretching from Greenland to Constantinople. They were skilled craftsmen, storytellers, and explorers who reached North America 500 years before Columbus ever set foot on European soil. What you're about to hear is the complete chronicle of how a collection of Scandinavian tribes transformed the medieval world through their unprecedented maritime expansion. We'll explore their complex society, their fascinating mythology, their revolutionary shipbuilding techniques, and their lasting impact on European civilization. Each chapter of this story has been carefully woven together to create a seamless narrative that will accompany you through the hours of the night. The year is 789, and along the windswept coast of Dorset, a royal official named Beaduhard approaches 3 mysterious ships that have landed near the Isle of Portland. These vessels, with their distinctive curved prows and shallow drafts, are unlike anything the Anglo-Saxons have seen before. The official assumes these strangers are merchants from across the North Sea, perhaps carrying furs, amber, or other northern goods to trade in the markets of Wessex. Beaduhard's assumption proves fatally wrong. These aren't merchants but warriors from the Norwegian region of Hordaland, and when he attempts to escort them to King Beorhtric's manor according to proper protocol, they respond with swift an. The official brutal violence and his men lie dead on the beach, their blood mixing with the sea foam as the mysterious visitors disappear back across the grey waters. This deadly encounter represents our first recorded glimpse of the people who would soon terrorize and transform medieval Europe. Yet this initial meeting was likely more accident than design, a trading expedition gone wrong rather than a calculated assault. The true beginning of the Viking Age would come 4 years later with an attack so shocking that it would echo through the halls of monasteries and royal courts across Christendom. The monastery of Lindisfarne sits on Holy Island, a tidal outcrop off the Northumbrian coast, connected to the mainland only at low tide. For over a century, this sacred place has served as a beacon of Christian learning and spirituality. The monks who call it home are peaceful scholars dedicated to prayer, manuscript illumination, and the preservation of knowledge. Their library contains priceless texts, their altar gleams with golden chalices and silver crosses, and their reputation for holiness attracts pilgrims from across the known world. On the morning of June 8th, 793, these peaceful brothers begin their daily prayers as they have for generations. The North Sea stretches endlessly toward the horizon, its grey waters offering no hint of the terror approaching from across those distant waves. But as the morning mist begins to clear, dark shapes emerge from the sea foam. Long, narrow vessels, with dragon heads carved into their prows, slice through the water with predatory grace. The ships beach themselves on the sandy shores of Holy Island with practiced efficiency. From their hulls emerge warriors whose very appearance strikes fear into the hearts of the watching monks. These men tower above average height, their blonde hair braided with silver rings, their arms decorated with intricate tattoos telling stories of distant battles. They carry round shields painted with fierce designs, their spears glinting in the morning light, like the teeth of some primordial beast. What follows shatters the medieval world's understanding of safety and sanctuary. The Vikings, for that is what history will call these seafaring raiders, show no respect for the sacred nature of the monastery. They burst through the wooden doors of the church, their axes splintering ancient timbers as terrified monks scatter like startled birds. Some brothers are cut down where they stand. Others are seized and dragged toward the waiting ships, destined for slavery in distant lands. The raiders work with terrifying efficiency, stripping the altar of its precious vessels, rolling up illuminated manuscripts to use as kindling for their cookfires, and loading their ships with everything of value they can find. The attack lasts only hours, but its psychological impact will reverberate for centuries. Word of Lindisfarne's destruction spreads like wildfire across medieval Europe, carried by surviving monks and travelling merchants who can barely believe what they've witnessed. The scholar Alcuin, advisor to Charlemagne himself, captures the horror of this moment in a letter written shortly after the attack. He speaks of omens that preceded the raid, of whirlwinds and fiery dragons seen flying across the sky, as if the very heavens had tried to warn of the coming catastrophe. His words reflect the medieval mind's struggle to comprehend how such holy ground could be violated by pagan warriors who seemed to appear from nowhere like demons from the sea. But who were these mysterious raiders, and what forces drove them from their northern homeland to strike at the heart of Christian Europe? To understand the Viking Age, we must journey back to the harsh landscapes of Scandinavia, where a perfect storm of environmental, social, and political factors was creating the conditions for unprecedented maritime expansion. The Scandinavian peninsula in the 8th century bore little resemblance to the unified nations of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden that exist today. Instead, the landscape was divided among countless petty kingdoms, each ruled by ambitious chieftains who measured their worth in gold arm rings and the loyalty of their warrior followers. These leaders, known as Jarls, controlled territories that might encompass only a few valleys or coastal settlements, yet they possessed the power of life and death over their subjects. The social structure of these early Scandinavian societies was both rigid and fluid, creating unique opportunities for social advancement through military prowess and daring enterprises. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage, who performed the back-breaking labour that sustained Viking society. Above them stood the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who owned their own service. At land and could bear arms in their law, the apex were the Jarls themselves, warrior nobles who traced their lineages back to legendary heroes and claimed descent from the gods themselves. This hierarchical system created intense competition among ambitious young men who found themselves with limited opportunities in their homeland. The harsh climate of Scandinavia meant that only the eldest son typically inherited enough land to support a family, leaving younger brothers to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The principle of primogeniture, while ensuring the integrity of family holdings, also created a surplus population of skilled warriors with nothing to lose and everything to gain from overseas adventures. The technology that made Viking expansion possible had been developing for centuries before the first raids on British shores. Scandinavian shipwrights had perfected a revolutionary construction technique known as clinker building, where overlapping oak planks were riveted together to create vessels that were both incredibly strong and remarkably flexible. These ships could bend with the waves rather than fighting against them, allowing them to survive storms that would have destroyed more rigid vessels. The shallow draft of Viking longships gave them unparalleled tactical advantages in both warfare and exploration. Drawing only 3 feet of water when fully loaded, these vessels could navigate rivers far inland, appearing suddenly at targets that thought themselves safe from seaborne assault. They could beach directly on sandy shores without need for harbours or docks, allowing raiders to strike swiftly and disappear before defenders could mount an effective response. But the longship was more than just a weapon of war. These versatile vessels served as cargo carriers for merchants, exploration platforms for adventurous navigators, and mobile homes for entire families seeking new lands to settle. The largest ships could carry 60 warriors or equivalent cargo, while smaller vessels might transport a single family with their livestock and possessions across the treacherous North Atlantic. The navigation techniques employed by Viking sailors represented centuries of accumulated maritime knowledge passed down through oral tradition from father to son. Without compass or sextant, these seafarers relied on their intimate understanding of wind patterns, wave behavior, and celestial navigation to find their way across vast expanses of open ocean. They could read the color of water to determine depth, identify the presence of distant land by observing cloud formations, and use the flight patterns of seabirds as natural compasses pointing toward shore. The religious worldview that motivated Viking expansion was as complex as it was compelling. The Norse pantheon, headed by the one-eyed god Odin, promised that warriors who died bravely in battle would be welcomed into Valhalla, the hall of the slain, where they would feast and fight alongside the gods themselves until the final battle at Ragnarok. This belief system not only removed the fear of death, but actually made it desirable, transforming every raid into a potential pathway to eternal glory. The concept of honor in Viking society was intimately tied to one's willingness to face danger and death in pursuit of wealth and fame. A warrior's reputation depended not just on his skill with weapons, but on his courage in seeking out the most dangerous and rewarding adventures. The accumulation of wealth through successful raids brought more than mere material comfort. It provided the means to attract and maintain a loyal following of warriors who would share in future enterprises. As we've seen, the stage was perfectly set for the explosion of Viking activity that would reshape medieval Europe. The political fragmentation of Scandinavia created a surplus of ambitious warriors. Technological advances had produced the finest ships in the world, and religious beliefs glorified death in battle while promising eternal rewards for the brave. All that was needed was a catalyst to transform these potential raiders into the terror of Christendom. That catalyst came in the form of increasing contact with the wealthy, poorly defended monasteries and trading centers of Western Europe. Scandinavian merchants had long traded with their southern neighbors, bringing back tales of churches filled with gold, monasteries defended only by unarmed monks, and kingdoms grown soft through centuries of peace. The contrast between the harsh, competitive world of Scandinavia and the seemingly easy pickings available across the North Sea proved irresistible to warriors raised on stories of heroic deeds and glorious conquests. The transformation of occasional raids into systematic campaigns began gradually, almost imperceptibly, as word of easy victories spread through the warrior halls of Scandinavia. Young men who had listened to tales of Lindisfarne's gold found themselves unable to concentrate on the mundane tasks of farming and fishing. The prospect of winning wealth and fame in a single summer's expedition proved far more appealing than spending decades clearing forests and tending livestock in the unforgiving northern climate. The success of early raids created a self-reinforcing cycle that would define the next 3 centuries of European history. Each successful expedition brought back not only treasure, but also detailed intelligence about potential targets. The raiders learned which monasteries held the greatest wealth, which kingdoms possessed the weakest defenses, and which routes offered the safest passage home. This accumulated knowledge transformed random piracy into strategic warfare, as Viking leaders began planning campaigns with the precision of modern military operations. The impact on Scandinavian society was profound and immediate. Successful raiders returned home laden with silver, gold, and exotic goods that had never before been seen in northern lands. Byzantine silk adorned the wives of men who had previously worn only rough woolen garments. Arabic silver coins became common currency in regions where barter had previously dominated trade. the influx of wealth created new social dynamics, as successful warriors used their plunder to attract followers and establish themselves as regional powers. The transformation of Viking warfare from opportunistic raiding to organized conquest can be traced through the evolution of their military tactics and social organization. Early raids involved small groups of perhaps 30 to 50 warriors, usually drawn from a single community and bound together by kinship ties or personal loyalty to a charismatic leader. These intimate bands operated more like extended family enterprises than formal military units, with decisions made through consensus rather than rigid command structures. As the scale of Viking operations expanded, so too did the complexity of their organizational methods. Successful leaders began attracting followers from beyond their immediate communities, creating diverse warrior bands united by shared ambitions rather than traditional bonds of kinship. These larger groups required more sophisticated leadership structures, clearer divisions of labor, and more elaborate systems for distributing plunder among participants. The emergence of professional Viking armies marked a crucial turning point in medieval European warfare. Unlike the seasonal raiders of earlier decades, these forces operated year-round, establishing winter camps in conquered territories and launching coordinated attacks across multiple fronts. The great heathen army that would later terrorize Anglo-Saxon England exemplified this evolution, comprising thousands of warriors from across Scandinavia, united under experienced commanders who had spent decades perfecting the art of medieval warfare. The psychological warfare employed by Viking raiders proved as effective as their military tactics in achieving their objectives. The very appearance of their distinctive ships on the horizon was often enough to send entire populations fleeing inland, abandoning their possessions in desperate attempts to escape capture or death. The Vikings cultivated this fear deliberately, understanding that terror could accomplish what force alone might not achieve. The ritualistic aspects of Viking warfare added another layer to their psychological impact on their enemies. Before major battles, warriors would work themselves into combat frenzy through ritualistic chanting, the consumption of fermented beverages, and the invocation of their war gods. The berserkers, elite warriors dedicated to Odin who fought in trance-like states of religious ecstasy, became legendary figures whose very names struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. The religious dimension of Viking expansion cannot be understated in its importance to understanding their motivations and methods. The Norse cosmology depicted life as a constant struggle between order and chaos, with warriors serving as agents of their gods in this eternal conflict. Every raid became a sacred act, every battle a religious ritual, and every death in combat a form of divine sacrifice that ensured the warrior's place in the afterlife. The concept of fate, or ward, permeated every aspect of Viking culture and profoundly influenced their approach to warfare and exploration. Norse mythology taught that every person's destiny was predetermined by the Norns, the three sisters who wove the threads of fate at the base of Yggdrasil, the World Tree. This belief freed warriors from the paralyzing fear of death that might have otherwise prevented them from undertaking dangerous expeditions, since their fate was already sealed regardless of their actions. The social bonds forged during long sea voyages and shared dangers created warrior brotherhoods that transcended traditional tribal and regional loyalties. Men who had rowed together across storm-tossed seas, fought side by side against desperate defenders, and shared equally in the distribution of plunder-developed loyalties that often proved stronger than family ties. These bonds would become crucial as Viking expansion evolved from raiding to conquest and settlement. The technological innovations that emerged from centuries of maritime experience gave Vikings decisive advantages over their land-based enemies. Their ships could appear suddenly at unexpected locations, strike swiftly, and disappear before effective resistance could be organized. This mobility allowed relatively small Viking forces to defeat much larger armies through superior tactical positioning and the element of surprise. The development of Viking navigational techniques represented one of the most remarkable achievements of medieval technology. Without instruments or charts, Norse navigators learned to read the subtle signs that indicated their position and direction. The color and temperature of ocean currents, the behavior of marine life, the formation of clouds on the horizon, and the position of celestial bodies all provided crucial information to experienced sailors. The establishment of Viking bases along the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and northern England marked the beginning of a new phase in their expansion. These fortified settlements served multiple purposes, providing secure harbours for their fleets, storage facilities for accumulated plunder, and staging areas for deeper penetration into enemy territory. The circular earthwork fortifications, known as ring forts, became characteristic features of the Viking presence in Western Europe. The evolution of Viking society during this period of expansion reflected the enormous wealth and new experiences gained through overseas adventures. Traditional social structures began adapting to accommodate the needs of a warrior culture that spent months away from home each year. Women assumed greater responsibilities for managing family property and local affairs, while successful raiders accumulated the resources necessary to challenge established hierarchies. The integration of captured slaves into Scandinavian society provided both economic benefits and cultural challenges. Thralls captured during raids brought new skills, languages, and perspectives to their northern homelands. Irish monks introduced advanced manuscript illumination techniques. Anglo-Saxon craftsmen taught new methods of metalworking, and Frankish merchants shared knowledge of international trade networks. The religious syncretism that resulted from contact with Christian populations created complex spiritual landscapes in Viking territories. While most raiders remained committed to their traditional gods, exposure to Christian beliefs and practices began influencing Norse religious thought. Some warriors adopted Christian symbols alongside their traditional protective amulets, while others showed interest in Christian concepts of divine justice and eternal salvation. The economic transformation of Scandinavian society proceeded in parallel with its military expansion. The enormous quantities of silver flowing into northern Europe from successful raids stimulated trade networks that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean Sea. Viking merchants established trading posts along major rivers, creating commercial highways that connected previously isolated regions. The development of urban centres in Scandinavia reflected the growing sophistication of Viking civilization. Towns like Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang became international marketplaces where merchants from across the known world gathered to exchange goods and information. These cosmopolitan centres facilitated cultural exchange and technological transfer that accelerated the development of Scandinavian society. The political consequences of Viking expansion began manifesting as successful war leaders accumulated the resources and followers necessary to challenge traditional authority structures. The wealth gained through raiding enabled ambitious individuals to maintain larger warrior bands, construct more impressive halls, and attract supporters from across wide geographical areas. As the 9th century progressed, the scattered raids that had characterized early Viking activity began consolidating into coordinated campaigns directed by increasingly sophisticated leadership structures. The age of opportunistic piracy was giving way to an era of systematic conquest that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of medieval Europe. The stage was now set for the next phase of Viking expansion, as the success of early raids attracted ever larger numbers of warriors to the prospect of overseas adventure. The small warbands that had terrorized isolated monasteries would soon give way to massive armies capable of conquering entire kingdoms and establishing permanent settlements across the breadth of the known world. The transformation from seasonal raiding to permanent conquest began with the arrival of what chroniclers would later call the Great Heathen Army. Unlike the small warbands that had previously struck isolated targets, this massive force represented a coalition of Viking leaders who had united their followers under a common purpose. The army that assembled in East Anglia during the winter of 865 numbered in the thousands, drawing warriors from across the Scandinavian world who had been lured by tales of English wealth and weakness. The brothers Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba emerged as the primary leaders of this unprecedented military enterprise. Each had earned his reputation through years of successful raiding, and together they commanded the loyalty of warriors from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, who might otherwise have fought each other as readily as they fought their enemies. Their alliance represented a new level of political sophistication in Viking warfare, demonstrating that these northern peoples could organize themselves into formidable military machines when sufficient incentive existed. The strategic brilliance of the great heathen army lay not in their individual prowess as warriors, but in their systematic approach to conquest. Rather than striking random targets and immediately returning to Scandinavia with their plunder, they established permanent winter camps in conquered territory and used these bases to launch coordinated attacks against multiple kingdoms. This represented a fundamental shift from piracy to warfare, from temporary raids to permanent occupation. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that faced this unprecedented threat were woefully unprepared for the scale and sophistication of the Viking assault. England in the 9th century was divided among 4 major kingdoms: Wessex in the south, Mercia in the Midlands, Northumbria in the north, and East Anglia in the east. Each maintained its own army and pursued its own interests, making coordinated resistance against a unified enemy virtually impossible. The political fragmentation that had long characterized Anglo-Saxon England now became a fatal weakness. While Viking forces could move rapidly between kingdoms, striking where resistance was weakest, the English kings found themselves unable to provide mutual support even when facing common destruction. Ancient rivalries and territorial disputes prevented the unity that might have saved them from conquest. King Edmund of East Anglia became the first royal victim of this new phase of Viking expansion. When the great heathen army demanded tribute and submission, Edmund chose to fight rather than surrender. His decision proved catastrophic. The Vikings destroyed his army in a single decisive battle, captured the king himself, and subjected him to a ritualistic execution that would become legendary throughout medieval Europe. The manner of Edmund's death reflected the religious significance that Vikings attached to their conquests. According to later accounts, the king was tied to a tree and shot full of arrows in a deliberate parody of Christian martyrdom, then beheaded while calling upon Christ for salvation. Whether historically accurate or not, such stories spread terror throughout Christian Europe and reinforced the perception of Vikings as agents of divine punishment for the sins of Christendom. The conquest of East Anglia provided the Vikings with their first permanent foothold on English soil and demonstrated the effectiveness of their new strategic approach. Rather than simply plundering and departing, they established administrative control over the conquered territory, appointed local officials to collect tribute, and used the kingdom's resources to support their ongoing military operations. This transformation from raiders to rulers marked a crucial evolution in Viking expansion. The success in East Anglia attracted additional Viking forces from across Scandinavia. As word spread that permanent conquest offered greater rewards than temporary raiding, ships arrived throughout 866 and 867, bringing fresh warriors eager to share in the plunder and land grants that successful conquest could provide. The great heathen army swelled to unprecedented size, becoming the largest military force that medieval England had ever faced. The psychological impact of Edmund's death and East Anglia's conquest reverberated throughout the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Vikings had demonstrated that they could not only defeat royal armies, but could eliminate entire kingdoms from the political map. The traditional assumption that divine protection would ultimately preserve Christian rulers from pagan enemies had been shattered by the reality of Viking military superiority. King Aelle of Northumbria faced the next major Viking assault, and his fate would prove even more gruesome than Edmund's. The Vikings claimed that Aelle had previously captured and executed Ragnar Lothbrok, one of their most celebrated leaders, by throwing him into a pit filled with venomous serpents. Whether this story was true or merely propaganda designed to justify their actions, the brothers Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba swore to avenge Ragnar's death through the ritual known as the Blood Eagle. The Siege of York in 867 showcased the evolved tactical capabilities of the great heathen army. Rather than relying on sudden assault and overwhelming force, the Vikings demonstrated sophisticated understanding of siege warfare. They surrounded the city with earthwork fortifications, cut off supply lines, and maintained their blockade through the harsh winter months. When York finally fell, the Vikings had proven they could conduct complex military operations requiring months of sustained effort. The capture and execution of King Aelle provided the Vikings with another opportunity to demonstrate their religious commitment to their war gods. The Blood Eagle ritual, in which the victim's ribs were cut away from the spine and his lungs pulled out to form wings, represented the ultimate sacrifice to Odin, the one-eyed god who demanded blood and death from his followers. The horrific spectacle served both religious and practical purposes, satisfying divine requirements while terrorizing potential enemies. The establishment of Viking control over Northumbria completed the conquest of northern England and provided the invaders with access to the rich agricultural lands of the Yorkshire Dales. Unlike East Anglia, which had been relatively poor and sparsely populated, Northumbria offered substantial resources that could support large military forces, while providing tribute to maintain Viking armies in the field. The kingdom's strategic position also provided control over crucial trade routes connecting Scotland and Ireland with continental Europe. The success of the Great Heathen Army in conquering two major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms within 3 years demonstrated the effectiveness of their strategic innovations. The combination of superior military organization, tactical flexibility, and systematic exploitation of conquered territories created a new model for medieval warfare that would influence military thinking for centuries to come. The Vikings had proven that barbarian armies could not only defeat civilized kingdoms, but could also establish lasting political control over sophisticated societies. The remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms now faced an existential threat, unlike anything their ancestors had encountered. The Vikings were no longer external raiders who could be bought off with tribute or defeated through temporary military campaigns. They had become a permanent presence on English soil, controlling territory and resources that enabled them to maintain continuous pressure on their remaining enemies. King Burgred of Mercia attempted to organize resistance against the Viking advance, but found himself hampered by the same political divisions that had doomed his northern neighbors. The Mercian nobility was divided between those who favored accommodation with the Vikings and those who insisted on continued resistance. This internal dissent weakened Mercian military effectiveness and provided the Vikings with opportunities to exploit political divisions among their enemies. The Viking assault on Mercia began in 868, with a systematic campaign designed to destroy the kingdom's military capacity while preserving its economic infrastructure. Rather than attempting to conquer the entire kingdom through direct assault, the Vikings employed a strategy of progressive territorial acquisition that gradually reduced Mercian power while minimizing their own casualties. They captured key fortified towns, destroyed opposing armies, piecemeal, and established control over crucial river crossings and trade routes. The sophistication of Viking military organization became increasingly apparent as their campaigns expanded in scope and complexity. The Great Heathen Army operated as a unified force when facing major enemies, but could divide into smaller contingents to conduct simultaneous operations across wide geographical areas. This flexibility allowed them to maintain pressure on multiple kingdoms, while preventing their enemies from concentrating superior forces against any single Viking army. The logistical capabilities that supported these extended campaigns represented remarkable achievements in medieval military administration. The Vikings maintained supply lines stretching across hundreds of miles, coordinated the movements of multiple army groups, and sustained large forces in hostile territory for months at a time. These accomplishments required sophisticated planning and administrative skills that belied the popular image of Vikings as undisciplined barbarians. The integration of conquered populations into Viking military and administrative structures revealed another dimension of their strategic thinking. Rather than simply exploiting defeated enemies, the Vikings demonstrated remarkable pragmatism in incorporating useful individuals into their own organizations. Anglo-Saxon nobles who submitted were often retained in positions of local authority, while skilled craftsmen, literate clerks, and experienced warriors were welcomed into Viking service regardless of their ethnic origins. This inclusive approach to conquest helped explain the Vikings' ability to control territories far larger than their original numbers would have suggested possible. By co-opting existing administrative structures and incorporating local elites into their political system, the Vikings avoided the need to impose alien institutions on resistant populations. Instead, they created hybrid governmental systems that combined Scandinavian military leadership with Anglo-Saxon administrative expertise. The religious tolerance that characterized Viking rule in conquered territories also contributed to their political success. While they showed no respect for Christian sanctity during their initial conquests, the Vikings generally allowed conquered populations to maintain their religious practices once political submission had been achieved. This pragmatic approach reduced resistance and enabled smoother integration of diverse populations under Viking authority. The economic policies implemented in conquered territories demonstrated sophisticated understanding of wealth creation and extraction. Rather than simply looting portable valuables and departing, the Vikings established systematic tribute collection that preserved local productivity while channeling resources to support their military operations. They encouraged trade, protected merchants, and maintained the agricultural systems that generated the surplus wealth necessary to sustain their armies. The cultural exchange that resulted from prolonged Viking occupation began transforming both conquerors and conquered in subtle but significant ways. Scandinavian warriors adopted Anglo-Saxon customs and technologies when they proved useful, while English populations absorbed Viking legal concepts, military techniques, and artistic styles. This gradual cultural synthesis created new hybrid societies that were neither purely English nor purely Scandinavian. The establishment of Viking settlements throughout conquered territories marked another crucial evolution in their expansion strategy. Rather than maintaining their forces as temporary occupying armies, the Vikings began encouraging permanent colonization by Scandinavian farmers and craftsmen. These settlements provided stable populations loyal to Viking authority, while creating economic foundations for long-term political control. The success of Viking conquest in England attracted attention from ambitious leaders throughout Scandinavia who recognized the opportunities available to those bold enough to seek them. The steady flow of warriors, settlers, and adventurers crossing the North Sea created a continuous process of cultural and political exchange that gradually transformed both Scandinavia and the conquered territories. The diplomatic relationships that developed between Viking leaders and remaining independent kingdoms revealed another dimension of their political sophistication. Rather than pursuing universal conquest regardless of cost, successful Viking leaders demonstrated remarkable flexibility in negotiating treaties, forming alliances, and establishing tributary relationships that achieved their objectives through diplomacy rather than warfare. The emergence of semi-independent Viking kingdoms within conquered territories created complex political situations that required delicate management. Local Viking leaders who had established themselves as regional powers sometimes pursued policies that conflicted with the broader strategic interests of the Great Heathen Army. These internal tensions occasionally erupted into open conflict between different Viking factions competing for resources and territory. The gradual transformation of Viking military leaders into territorial rulers required significant adjustments in their political and administrative capabilities. Warriors who had gained authority through martial prowess now found themselves responsible for tax collection, legal administration, and economic management. Some adapted successfully to these civilian responsibilities, while others proved unable to make the transition from war leader to territorial governor. The influence of conquered populations on Viking culture became increasingly apparent as permanent settlement replaced temporary occupation. Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, administrative practices, and social customs began influencing Viking behavior in conquered territories. Intermarriage between Scandinavian settlers and local populations created new generations whose cultural identity combined elements from both traditions. The religious syncretism that developed in areas of prolonged Viking settlement created fascinating combinations of pagan and Christian beliefs and practices. Some Vikings converted to Christianity for political advantage while maintaining private devotion to their traditional gods. Others developed hybrid religious systems that incorporated Christian symbols and rituals into Norse mythological frameworks. The technological innovations that emerged from cultural contact between Vikings and conquered populations accelerated the development of both societies. Scandinavian shipbuilding techniques improved through exposure to Anglo-Saxon woodworking methods, while English metalworking benefited from Viking expertise in weapon manufacturing. These exchanges created technological advantages that benefited both cultures. The educational opportunities that became available to Vikings through conquest of literate societies had profound long-term consequences for Scandinavian culture. Exposure to written law, historical chronicles, and religious literature gradually introduced concepts of record-keeping and administrative documentation that would transform Viking governmental practices in subsequent generations. As the 870s progressed, the political map of England had been fundamentally redrawn by Viking conquest. Two major kingdoms had been eliminated entirely, a third was under severe pressure, and only Wessex in the south remained as an independent Anglo-Saxon realm. The success of the great heathen army had exceeded even their most optimistic expectations, transforming them from raiders into the dominant political force in medieval England. The stage was now set for the climactic confrontation between the Vikings and the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. In Wessex, a young prince named Alfred was preparing to face the greatest challenge in the history of his people, while the victorious Vikings planned the final campaigns that would complete their conquest of England. The kingdom of Wessex stretched across the fertile lands of southern England, its rolling downs and river valleys, supporting a population that had grown prosperous through generations of relative peace. Unlike the fractured realms to the north, Wessex possessed a stronger tradition of centralized authority and military organization that would prove crucial in the trials ahead. The royal court at Winchester had watched with growing alarm as news arrived of each Viking victory, understanding that their kingdom now stood as the final barrier against complete Scandinavian domination of England. King Ethelred of Wessex faced an impossible situation, as reports reached him of the great heathen army's inexorable advance southward. His kingdom, while more unified than its northern neighbours, lacked the military resources necessary to confront an enemy force that had already proven its superiority against larger and better established realms. The traditional fyrd system, which relied on part-time soldiers drawn from the agricultural population, seemed inadequate against professional Viking warriors who had spent years perfecting their craft through constant warfare. The political structure of Wessex, however, possessed certain advantages that had been lacking in the conquered kingdoms. The royal family maintained stronger bonds of loyalty with their nobility, while the kingdom's geographical position had allowed it to avoid the internal conflicts that had weakened Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. These factors would prove decisive in the coming struggle, though their importance was not yet apparent to contemporary observers, who saw only an overwhelmingly powerful enemy approaching their borders. Prince Alfred, younger brother to King Ethelred, emerged during this crisis as a military leader of exceptional capability and vision. Unlike many of his contemporaries who clung to traditional tactical approaches that had proven ineffective against Viking innovations, Alfred demonstrated remarkable adaptability in developing new strategies specifically designed to counter Scandinavian advantages. His youth, rather than being a disadvantage, allowed him to think creatively about problems that had confounded older and more experienced commanders. The first major confrontation between Wessex and the Great Heathen Army occurred at Reading in January 871, when the Vikings established a fortified camp at the confluence of the Thames and Kennet rivers. The position they chose demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of military engineering, as the river junction provided natural defences on two sides, while offering excellent communications with their naval forces. The earthwork fortifications they constructed transformed their camp into a virtually impregnable stronghold that could serve as a base for operations throughout the Thames Valley. King Ethelred and Prince Alfred led the Wessex army in a desperate assault against the Viking fortifications, hoping to destroy the enemy force before it could establish permanent control over the strategically crucial river junction. The battle that followed revealed both the courage of the Anglo-Saxon warriors and the futility of traditional tactics against Viking defensive preparations. Wave after wave of English attacks broke against the earthwork ramparts like ocean swells against coastal cliffs, achieving nothing except horrific casualties among the flower of Wessex nobility, their methods to exploit the weaknesses of their enemies. The tactical innovations employed by rather than meeting the Anglo-Saxon assault Vikings at Reading, demonstrated how thoroughly they had adapted with their own frontal attack. They allowed the English forces to exhaust themselves against prepared positions before launching devastating counterattacks that shattered the survivors. The combination of defensive earthworks, coordinated archery, and precisely timed cavalry charges created a tactical system that maximized Viking advantages while minimizing their exposure to enemy strengths. The defeat at Reading sent shockwaves throughout Wessex and seemed to confirm that the kingdom would suffer the same fate as its northern neighbours. The loss of so many experienced warriors and noble leaders in a single battle severely weakened the kingdom's military capacity and raised serious questions about its ability to continue resistance. Many of the surviving nobles began quietly considering whether submission might be preferable to the complete destruction that continued defiance seemed certain that would make him one of the greatest military leaders in English history, rather than allowing desp to bring. Prince Alfred's response to this catastrophic defeat revealed the qualities heir to paralyze his kingdom's resistance. He immediately began analyzing the tactical lessons of the Reading disaster and developing new approaches that might prove more effective against Viking methods. His willingness to abandon traditional Anglo-Saxon military doctrine in favor of innovative strategies specifically designed to counter enemy advantages marked him as a commander of exceptional intellectual flexibility. The series of battles that followed, Reading throughout the spring and summer of 871, became known as Alfred's Year of Battles, as the young prince led increasingly desperate attempts to halt the Viking advance into the heart of Wessex. Each engagement provided new insights into enemy tactics and capabilities, while also demonstrating the gradual evolution of Anglo-Saxon military thinking under the pressure of existential crisis. The accumulated experience of these campaigns would ultimately prove more valuable than the tactical victories or defeats of individual battles. The Battle of Ashdown in January 871 marked the first significant Anglo-Saxon victory against the Great Heathen Army and provided crucial evidence that the Vikings were not invincible when faced with appropriate tactics and determined resistance. Alfred's careful analysis of previous defeats had identified the importance of denying the enemy time to establish prepared positions, leading him to launch a dawn attack that caught the Viking forces while they were still organizing their battle line. The tactical success at Ashdown resulted from Alfred's innovative approach to battlefield command and his willingness to adapt traditional Anglo-Saxon fighting methods to exploit specific Viking weaknesses. Rather than attempting to match the enemy's superior organization and equipment through direct confrontation, he employed rapid movement and surprise to achieve local superiority at the decisive point. The victory demonstrated that creative tactical thinking could overcome apparent material disadvantages when applied with sufficient skill and determination. the psychological impact of Ashdown extended far beyond its immediate military significance, as news and provided hope to populations that had begun of the Anglo-Saxon victory spread throughout England to consider Viking conquest inevitable. The battle proved that the great heathen army could be defeated under the right circumstances, inspiring renewed resistance in areas that had been preparing to submit. More importantly, for the long-term struggle, it established Alfred's reputation as a military commander capable of matching the most experienced Viking war leaders. The death of King Ethelred in April 871, just months after the victory at Ashdown, thrust the full burden of defending Wessex onto Alfred's shoulders at the most critical moment in the kingdom's history. The 22-year-old prince found himself responsible for continuing a war that had already devastated his realm, while simultaneously managing the complex political and administrative challenges of royal authority. The transition of power during active military campaigns created additional vulnerabilities that the Vikings were quick to exploit. Alfred's accession to the throne coincided with a renewed Viking offensive that threatened to complete the conquest that had been temporarily delayed by the Ashdown victory. The enemy forces, reinforced by additional contingents from Scandinavia, launched coordinated attacks across multiple fronts that stretched Wessex's defensive capabilities beyond their limits. The new king faced the stark choice between continuing a seemingly hopeless military resistance or negotiating the best possible terms for his kingdom's submission. The decision to continue fighting rather than seek accommodation with the Vikings reflected both Alfred's personal courage and his sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics involved in the conflict. Submission would have preserved his kingdom's immediate existence, but would have reduced him to the status of a tributary ruler, dependent on Viking goodwill for his continued authority. The alternative of continued resistance, while fraught with enormous risks, offered the possibility of maintaining genuine independence if successful military strategies could be developed. The summer campaigns of 871 saw Alfred employing increasingly sophisticated defensive strategies designed to minimize his forces' exposure to enemy strengths while maximizing opportunities to exploit Viking weaknesses. Rather than seeking decisive battles that might result in catastrophic defeat, he adopted a strategy of gradual attrition that aimed to exhaust enemy resources while preserving his own military capacity for crucial moments. This approach required exceptional discipline and strategic patience, as it often meant accepting temporary territorial losses to achieve longer-term strategic objectives. The establishment of fortified camps throughout Wessex represented Alfred's most significant military innovation during this period, as these defensive positions provided secure bases from which to conduct guerrilla operations against Viking supply lines and communication networks. The camps were positioned to control crucial river crossings, road junctions, and supply routes, creating a defensive network that could disrupt enemy operations even when individual positions were temporarily abandoned. This strategic approach transformed the character of the conflict from a series of set-piece battles to a complex campaign of maneuver and attrition. The Viking response to Alfred's defensive innovations demonstrated their own tactical flexibility and strategic sophistication. Rather than attempting to storm each fortified position through direct assault, they began employing systematic siege techniques designed to reduce enemy strongholds through blockade and starvation. The resulting campaigns became tests of endurance and logistical capability rather than simple demonstrations of military prowess, requiring both sides to develop new approaches to supply and reinforcement. The winter of 871-872 brought a temporary respite from active campaigning as both sides consolidated their positions and prepared for the renewed fighting that spring would inevitably bring. Alfred used this breathing space to implement fundamental reforms in his kingdom's military organization, developing new systems of recruitment, training, and equipment that would better prepare his forces for the challenges ahead. These reforms went far beyond simple tactical adjustments, encompassing comprehensive changes in how Wessex organized and sustained its military efforts. The creation of a professional standing army, represented perhaps Alfred's most revolutionary military innovation as it broke with centuries of Anglo-Saxon tradition that had relied primarily on temporary levies of part-time soldiers. The new professional force, maintained at royal expense and trained specifically for warfare against Viking enemies, provided Wessex with military capabilities that could match those of their opponents. The expense of maintaining such a force required significant implemented during this period addressed specific weaknesses that the technological improvements that Alfred economic reforms that transformed the kingdom's fiscal administration had been revealed through bitter experience in previous campaigns. Enhanced armor and weapons, improved siege equipment, and better communications systems all contributed to increasing the effectiveness of Wessex forces against their formidable enemies. Perhaps more importantly, the systematic training programs that accompanied these material improvements created a more professional military culture that could adapt quickly to changing tactical requirements. The naval innovations that Alfred pioneered during this period would prove crucial to his ultimate success against the Vikings, whose maritime supremacy had been fundamental to their military advantages. The construction of larger, faster warships, specifically designed to match Viking longships in speed and maneuverability, represented a direct challenge to enemy naval dominance. These vessels, crewed by professional sailors trained in Viking-style tactics, created new strategic possibilities for interdicting enemy supply lines and preventing reinforcements from reaching Viking armies operating inland. The intelligence networks that Alfred established throughout England provided crucial information about enemy movements and intentions that had previously been unavailable to Anglo-Saxon commanders. These networks, staffed by merchants, clergy, and sympathetic nobles in Viking-controlled territories, created unprecedented strategic awareness that allowed Wessex forces to anticipate and counter enemy operations. The systematic gathering and analysis of intelligence represented another dimension of Alfred's innovative approach to warfare. The diplomatic initiatives that Alfred pursued during periods of military stalemate demonstrated his recognition that the understanding of enemy motivations and internal negotiations with Viking leaders revealed sophisticated conflict could not be resolved through purely military means. His divisions that could potentially be exploited to Wessex's advantage. While these diplomatic efforts rarely produced lasting agreements, they provided valuable insights into enemy decision-making processes and occasionally created opportunities for tactical surprise. The economic warfare that became an increasingly important aspect of the conflict reflected both sides' recognition that military victory required sustained material support. Alfred's efforts to disrupt Viking trade networks and tribute collection systems aimed to undermine the economic foundations of enemy military operations. Similarly, Viking attempts to destroy Wessex's agricultural and commercial infrastructure sought to eliminate the resources necessary for continued resistance. The religious dimensions of the conflict took on greater significance as the struggle continued, with both sides invoking divine support for their cause. Alfred's presentation of the war as a crusade to preserve Christian civilization against pagan conquest helped mobilize popular support while providing ideological justification for the enormous sacrifices required. The Vikings, for their part, continued to view their campaigns as religious enterprises blessed by their war gods and destined to fulfill divine will. The cultural exchanges that occurred despite the military conflict created unexpected opportunities for mutual understanding and occasional cooperation. Viking warriors who had spent years in England often developed appreciation for Anglo-Saxon customs and achievements, while English populations in occupied territories gradually adapted to Scandinavian legal and social practices. These cultural connections sometimes provided alternatives to purely military solutions when political circumstances permitted negotiation. The evolution of battlefield tactics throughout this period reflected the continuous adaptation that characterized the conflict as both sides learned from their experiences and developed new approaches to familiar problems. The increasing sophistication of siege warfare, the development of coordinated cavalry operations, and the integration of naval and land forces all demonstrated how military innovation accelerated under the pressure of existential conflict. As 872 drew to a close, the war between Alfred and the Great Heathen Army had evolved into a complex struggle that encompassed military, political, economic, and cultural dimensions far beyond the simple raiding that had characterized earlier Viking activities. Both sides had demonstrated remarkable adaptability and resilience, suggesting that the ultimate resolution of the conflict would require decisive advantages that had not yet emerged. The stage was set for the climactic campaigns that would determine not only the fate of Wessex, but the future political organization of England itself. The coming trials would test every innovation that Alfred had implemented and every lesson that both sides had learned through years of bitter experience. The final phase of the struggle would reveal whether the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom possessed the strength and ingenuity necessary to preserve its independence against the most formidable military force that medieval Europe had yet produced. The year 873 dawned with ominous portents across the English countryside, as reports reached Alfred's court of massive Viking reinforcements arriving from Denmark and Norway. The Great Heathen Army, already formidable beyond anything previously encountered, swelled to unprecedented proportions as ambitious warriors from across Scandinavia flocked to share in what appeared to be the final conquest manpower, but also new tactical innovations and siege of Anglo-Saxon England. These fresh contingents brought not only additional equipment that threatened to overwhelm even Alfred's carefully prepared defences. The strategic situation facing Wessex had deteriorated significantly during the winter months, as Viking forces consolidated their control over the Midlands and established permanent bases along the Thames Valley. These fortified positions created a network of mutually supporting strongholds that could coordinate operations across wide geographical areas, while providing secure supply lines stretching back to Scandinavia. The systematic nature of these preparations revealed the extent to which Viking strategy had evolved beyond opportunistic raiding toward comprehensive territorial conquest. The psychological pressure on Alfred's kingdom intensified as refugees from Viking-occupied territories streamed southward, bringing tales of destruction and displacement that undermined civilian morale. These displaced populations, while providing additional manpower for defensive operations, also strained Wessex's already limited resources and created administrative challenges that competed with military priorities for the king's attention. The refugee crisis demonstrated how thoroughly the Vikings had disrupted traditional social structures throughout northern and central England. The religious communities of Wessex faced particular anguish, as monasteries throughout the occupied territories were systematically destroyed or converted to secular purposes. The monks and nuns who escaped Viking conquest carried with them precious manuscripts, religious relics, and accumulated knowledge that represented centuries of scholarly achievement. The preservation of this intellectual heritage became another dimension of Alfred's responsibilities, as he recognized that military victory would prove meaningless if the cultural foundations of Christian civilization were allowed to perish. The spring offensive launched by the Vikings in 873 demonstrated tactical sophistication that surpassed even their previous achievements, as coordinated armies advanced simultaneously along multiple axes to prevent Wessex from concentrating its forces at any single threatened point. The enemy's ability to maintain communication and coordination across such vast distances revealed improvements in their organizational capabilities that made them increasingly formidable opponents. Alfred found himself constantly reacting to enemy initiatives rather than pursuing his own strategic objectives. The siegifications. Rather than rel techniques employed by the Vikings during this campaign, Anglo-Saxon thought of learning from previous encounters with period showed clear evidence solely on direct assault or simple blockade. They began employing sophisticated engineering methods that included undermining, siege towers, and coordinated artillery bombardments using captured Roman catapults. These innovations forced Alfred to develop countermeasures that strained his kingdom's technological and economic resources to their limits. The naval war that raged along England's coasts throughout 873 saw Alfred's experimental warships engaged in increasingly desperate battles against Viking fleets that seemed to multiply with each passing month. The enemy's continued naval supremacy enabled them to maintain secure communications with Scandinavia while preventing Wessex from receiving potential assistance from continental allies. Despite improvements in ship design and crew training, Alfred's naval forces remained outnumbered and outmaneuvered by their more experienced opponents. The economic strain of prolonged warfare began manifesting in dangerous ways as agricultural production declined due to the constant threat of Viking raids and the diversion of manpower to military service. Food shortages in some regions approached famine conditions, while the kingdom's treasury faced depletion from the enormous costs of maintaining professional military forces and constructing defensive fortifications. These economic pressures created political tensions within Wessex, as nobles questioned whether continued resistance was economically sustainable. The diplomatic overtures that reached Alfred's court during the summer of 873 revealed internal divisions within the Viking leadership that offered potential opportunities for exploitation. Some enemy commanders, grown wealthy from years of successful campaigning, began showing interest in permanent settlement rather than continued warfare. These peace-feelers, while requiring careful handling to avoid appearing as signs of weakness, suggested that the Viking coalition might not remain united indefinitely. The intelligence networks that Alfred had cultivated throughout England provided increasingly detailed information about enemy dispositions and intentions, revealing both strengths and vulnerabilities in Viking positions. Reports from occupied territories described growing tensions between different Scandinavian groups competing for the best lands and most profitable administrative positions. These ethnic and regional divisions within the enemy coalition offered possibilities for diplomatic manipulation that could supplement military resistance. The technological innovations that emerged from the pressure of constant warfare accelerated the pace of military development in ways that would influence European combat for generations to come. Improvements in metallurgy produced superior weapons and armor, while advances in siege engineering created more effective methods of attack and defense. The exchange of prisoners and defectors facilitated technology transfer that benefited both sides, though the Vikings' larger resource base generally enabled them to implement innovations more quickly and extensively. The religious revival that swept through Wessex during this period of crisis reflected the population's desperate search for divine intervention in their seemingly hopeless struggle. Churches overflowed with worshippers seeking spiritual comfort and supernatural assistance, while pilgrimages to holy sites increased dramatically as people sought divine favor through religious devotion. Alfred skillfully channeled this religious fervor toward military purposes, presenting the war as a holy crusade that demanded ultimate sacrifice from all true Christians. The administrative reforms that Alfred implemented during this period created more efficient systems for mobilizing and sustaining military forces while maintaining essential civilian functions. New methods of taxation, recruitment, and supply distribution enabled the kingdom to extract maximum military potential from its limited resources. These bureaucratic innovations, while less dramatic than battlefield victories, proved crucial to Wessex's ability to maintain resistance over extended periods. The cultural changes that occurred within Viking-occupied territories began creating unexpected complications for the conquerors, as Scandinavian settlers gradually adopted local customs and developed emotional attachments to their new homes. Second-generation Vikings, born and raised in England, often possessed limited knowledge of Scandinavian traditions and felt stronger connections to their adopted homeland than to distant ancestral territories. These cultural transformations created potential sources of internal division within the Viking political structure. The evolution of military tactics during 873 reflected the continuous adaptation that characterized this prolonged conflict, as both sides sought decisive advantages through innovation and experimentation. The developmentary units created more flexible tactical systems capable of responding to combined arms operations, integrating infantry, cavalry, and arch effectively to diverse battlefield situations. These tactical advances required extensive training and coordination that tested the organizational capabilities of both armies. The fortification systems that dotted the English landscape by late 873 represented the most comprehensive defensive network constructed in medieval Europe up to that point. Alfred's program of fortress construction, known as the Boer system, created mutually supporting strongholds positioned to control key strategic points throughout Wessex. Each fortress was designed to accommodate specific garrison requirements while serving as administrative centers for their surrounding regions. The logistical challenges of maintaining large armies in hostile territory became increasingly difficult for both sides, as local resources were exhausted and supply lines stretched to their breaking points. The Vikings' dependence on tribute and plunder for sustaining their forces created vulnerabilities that Alfred's strategists began exploiting through targeted attacks on enemy supply convoys and tribute collection operations. These economic warfare tactics complemented direct military action by undermining the material foundations of enemy military operations. The winter of 873-874 brought unusual severity to the English climate, creating additional hardships for military forces already strained by prolonged campaigning. The harsh weather conditions favored defensive operations over offensive maneuvers, providing temporary respite for Wessex forces while creating supply difficulties for Vikings operating far from their bases. Both sides used this enforced pause in major operations to consolidate their positions and prepare for the decisive campaigns that spring would inevitably bring. The diplomatic revolution that occurred during the winter months saw Alfred establishing contact with Frankish rulers who faced similar Viking pressures along their northern borders. These preliminary negotiations explored possibilities for coordinated resistance against common enemies while sharing intelligence about Viking capabilities and intentions. The potential for international cooperation against Viking expansion represented a new dimension in the conflict that could significantly alter strategic calculations on both sides. The emergence of Viking settlements throughout occupied England created new political dynamics that complicated the simple conquest-resistance narrative that had previously characterized the conflict. Scandinavian colonists, who had invested years in establishing farms and businesses, often possessed different interests from the warrior elites who led military operations. These civilian Vikings sometimes showed greater willingness to negotiate with Anglo-Saxon authorities than their military leaders, creating opportunities for divide and conquer strategies. The technological exchanges that resulted from prolonged contact between the two cultures accelerated innovations in multiple fields beyond pure military applications. Agricultural techniques, craftsmanship methods, and navigational knowledge flowed in both directions, creating hybrid technologies that combined the best elements from both traditions. These peaceful exchanges continued even during active warfare, demonstrating the complex nature of cultural contact in medieval conflicts. The legal systems that evolved in areas of mixed population created fascinating syntheses of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian juridical traditions. Local courts often employed hybrid procedures that incorporated elements from both legal systems, while marriage and property laws adapted to accommodate the practical needs of ethnically diverse communities. These legal innovations would eventually influence the development of English common law in ways that persisted long after the political resolution of the Viking conflicts. The religious syncretism that developed in regions of prolonged Viking settlement created unique spiritual landscapes, where pagan and Christian elements coexisted in various combinations. Some Vikings adopted Christian beliefs while maintaining traditional practices, while certain Anglo-Saxons incorporated Norse mythological elements into their worldview. These religious adaptations reflected the complex cultural negotiations that occurred at the personal level despite the political and military conflicts between their respective communities. The educational opportunities that became available through cultural contact enabled knowledge transfer that benefited both societies while English scholars gained access to Scandinavian oral, unexpected ways. Viking warriors exposed to Anglo-Saxon literacy often developed appreciation for written record-keeping, traditions that preserved historical and mythological knowledge unavailable in written form. These intellectual exchanges created new possibilities for cultural development that transcended the immediate political conflicts. The economic transformations that occurred in regions under Viking control revealed the extent to which Scandinavian administrative practices differed from traditional Anglo-Saxon systems. The Vikings' emphasis on commercial activity and their extensive trading networks brought new prosperity to some areas while disrupting established patterns of agricultural production and local exchange. These economic changes created both opportunities and challenges for local populations attempting to adapt to new political realities. The military innovations that emerged from the pressure of constant warfare included developments in communications, logistics, and battlefield medicine that would influence European military practice for centuries. Improved systems for coordinating operations across wide geographical areas, more efficient methods of supplying forces in hostile territory, and better techniques for treating wounded warriors all contributed to the increasing sophistication of medieval warfare. The architectural achievements of this period reflected the massive investment in defensive construction that characterized both sides' strategic thinking. The fortifications built during with innovations specifically adapted to counter contemporary siege techniques. These structures, 873, 874, incorporate represented some of the most advanced military engineering of their design principles, derived from Roman engineering, combined medieval period, and established patterns that would influence fortress design throughout Europe. The social changes that accompanied prolonged warfare affected every level of society as traditional hierarchies adapted to the demands of military emergency. Social mobility increased dramatically as successful warriors gained wealth and status through military achievement, while established nobles who failed to adapt to new conditions often found their influence diminished. These social transformations created both opportunities and tensions that would persist long after the military conflicts had ended. The cultural productions of this period, including poetry, craftsmanship, and religious art, reflected the intense emotions and experiences generated by the life and death struggle between two civilizations. The literary works created during these years captured both the heroism and tragedy of the conflict, while preserving historical memories that would influence cultural identity for generations. These artistic achievements demonstrated that cultural creativity could flourish even under the most challenging circumstances. As 874 approached, the conflict between Alfred and the great heathen army had evolved into something far more complex than a simple struggle between conqueror and defender. The prolonged interaction between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations had created new hybrid societies, innovative institutions, and unprecedented cultural syntheses that would outlast the political resolution of their military conflict. The stage was set for the final phase of this epic struggle, where the accumulated innovations, adaptations, and lessons learned by both sides would determine not only the immediate military outcome, but the long-term trajectory of English civilization itself. The coming year would test every strategy, every alliance, and every innovation that the combatants had developed through 5 years of bitter experience. The resolution of this conflict would reshape the political map of Europe while establishing precedents that would influence the development of medieval kingdoms throughout the continent. The final campaigns were about to begin, and their outcome would echo through the halls of history for centuries to come. The decisive moment that would determine the fate of Anglo-Saxon England arrived with the spring thaw of 874, as intelligence reports reached Alfred's court, describing unprecedented Viking preparations for what appeared to be their final offensive. The great heathen army had spent the winter months not in rest, but in meticulous planning, gathering supplies and reinforcements for a campaign designed to eliminate the last bastion of independent Anglo-Saxon resistance. The scale of their preparations dwarfed anything previously attempted, suggesting that the Viking leadership had committed themselves irrevocably to completing the conquest of England within the coming year. The strategic position that Alfred faced as these reports accumulated painted a picture of overwhelming enemy superiority in virtually every measurable category. The Vikings possessed numerical advantages that contemporary chroniclers estimated at 3 or 4 to 1, though such figures likely reflected the psychological impact of facing seemingly infinite enemy reinforcements rather than precise military intelligence. More critically, the enemy maintained absolute naval supremacy that enabled them to coordinate operations across vast distances while preventing any possibility of external assistance reaching the beleaguered kingdom of Wessex. The economic resources available to the Viking forces had grown exponentially through 5 years of systematic exploitation of conquered territories, providing them with wealth sufficient to maintain professional armies indefinitely while purchasing additional support from Scandinavian mercenaries, attracted by the promise of easy victories and rich rewards. In contrast, Wessex faced near bankruptcy as the enormous costs of prolonged resistance strained the kingdom's fiscal capacity beyond sustainable limits. The disparity in available resources threatened to determine the conflict's outcome regardless of tactical innovations or strategic brilliance. The psychological warfare that the Vikings employed during their final preparations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how terror could achieve objectives that pure military force might not accomplish as efficiently. Reports reached Alfred's court of systematic atrocities committed against civilian populations in occupied territories, designed not merely to punish resistance, but to communicate the futility of continued defiance to populations still under Anglo-Saxon control. These calculated brutalities served the dual purpose of extracting maximum resources from conquered areas while undermining enemy morale through demonstration of Viking ruthlessness. The diplomatic isolation that surrounded Wessex during this critical period reflected the success of Viking expansion throughout Western Europe, as potential allies found themselves either conquered, threatened, or too distant to provide meaningful assistance. The Frankish kingdoms, traditional sources of continental support for Anglo-Saxon rulers, faced their own Viking pressures and could spare no resources for foreign adventures. The remaining Celtic kingdoms of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland possessed neither the military capacity nor the political inclination to challenge Viking supremacy on behalf of their Anglo-Saxon neighbours. The religious crisis that deepened throughout Wessex during these months of preparation reflected the profound theological challenges posed by apparent divine abandonment of Christian civilization to pagan conquest. Churches that had once overflowed with confident worshippers now echoed with desperate prayers and anguished questions about why God would permit his faithful servants to face such overwhelming tribulation. The crisis of faith that spread through religious communities threatened to undermine the spiritual foundations that had sustained Anglo-Saxon resistance through previous trials. The technological disparities that had emerged through years of conflict continued favouring the Vikings, whose access to continental European metalworking traditions and captured Roman engineering knowledge enabled them to field superior weapons and siege equipment. The systematic destruction of Anglo-Saxon craft centres during previous campaigns had eliminated many of the skilled artisans, whose expertise might have enabled Wessex to compete technologically with their enemies. The remaining craftsmen worked desperately to produce adequate equipment for Alfred's forces, but lacked both the resources and knowledge necessary to match Viking technological advantages. The intelligence networks that had previously provided Alfred with crucial information about enemy movements and intentions began failing as Viking counterintelligence operations systematically identified and eliminated Anglo-Saxon agents throughout occupied territories. The loss of reliable information about enemy capabilities and plans forced Alfred's strategists to operate increasingly in darkness, making defensive preparations based on incomplete knowledge and educated guesswork rather than solid intelligence. This intelligence drought occurred precisely when accurate information had become most crucial for survival. The administrative burden of coordinating resistance across Wessex's remaining territories strained the kingdom's governmental capacity, as traditional peacetime institutions proved inadequate for managing the complex requirements of total war. The need to simultaneously maintain military forces, coordinate civilian evacuations, manage refugee populations, and preserve essential economic functions exceeded the capabilities of administrative systems designed for routine governance rather than existential crisis. These bureaucratic challenges created additional vulnerabilities that enemy forces stood ready to exploit. The social tensions that had been building within Wessex throughout the prolonged conflict reached dangerous levels as different classes and regions began questioning whether continued resistance served their particular interests. Wealthy nobles whose estates lay in exposed frontier regions sometimes advocated accommodation with the Vikings to preserve their personal holdings, while urban merchants worried that prolonged warfare would destroy the commercial networks upon which their prosperity depended. These internal divisions threatened to fragment the political unity that had sustained Anglo-Saxon resistance through previous crises. The military innovations that Alfred had implemented during previous campaigns faced their ultimate test as Viking forces prepared to employ countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize Anglo-Saxon tactical advantages. The enemy's systematic study of previous engagements had identified weaknesses in Alfred's defensive strategies and siege techniques, leading to the development of new assault methods that promised to overcome even the most sophisticated fortifications. The technological arms race that had characterized the conflict now seemed to favor the side with superior resources and manufacturing capacity. The logistical challenges facing both armies as they prepared for decisive campaigns had grown exponentially with the scale of forces involved and the geographical scope of operations. The Vikings faced the complex task of coordinating multiple army groups across hundreds of miles while maintaining supply lines stretching back to Scandinavia, a challenge that required unprecedented organizational sophistication. Alfred's forces confronted equally daunting problems in concentrating scattered defensive units for decisive battles while preserving essential territorial control and civilian protection. The seasonal timing of the coming campaign created additional pressures, as both sides recognized that the outcome of spring and summer operations would likely determine the war's final result. The Vikings could not sustain indefinitely the enormous costs of maintaining such massive forces far from their homeland, while Wessex lacked the resources to survive another winter of total war mobilization. These temporal constraints added urgency to military planning and reduced the margin for error in tactical execution. The cultural dimensions of the conflict had evolved beyond simple ethnic or religious antagonism to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of civilization and political organization in medieval Europe. The Viking success in establishing stable governmental institutions throughout conquered territories challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between cultural sophistication and political legitimacy. Their demonstration that effective administration could emerge from warrior societies forced contemporary observers to reconsider basic assumptions about the sources of political authority. The legal innovations that had developed in areas of mixed population created precedents that would influence European jurisprudence for centuries, as hybrid court systems successfully resolved disputes between parties operating under different cultural traditions. The practical success of these legal syntheses suggested possibilities for cultural accommodation that transcended the immediate military conflict, offering glimpses of alternative futures where conquest might lead to synthesis rather than simple domination or resistance. The economic transformations occurring throughout England demonstrated how warfare could accelerate social and technological change by disrupting established patterns and creating opportunities for innovation. The destruction of traditional institutions forced survivors to develop new methods of organization and production that often proved more efficient than their predecessors. These adaptive innovations created unexpected benefits that partially offset the enormous costs of military conflict. The religious syncretism that continued developing despite official hostility between Christian and pagan communities revealed the complex dynamics of cultural interaction under conditions of political conflict. Individual believers on both sides often found common ground in shared human experiences of loss, hope, and spiritual seeking that transcended their official theological differences. These personal connections sometimes created possibilities for accommodation that formal diplomatic negotiations could not achieve. The architectural legacy of the fortification programs implemented by both sides would influence European military engineering for generations, as the innovative defensive designs developed under pressure of constant warfare established new standards for fortress construction. The combination of Roman engineering principles with contemporary tactical requirements produced defensive systems that represented significant advances in military architecture. These structural innovations demonstrated how military necessity could drive technological progress in unexpected directions. The literary productions of this period captured the epic scope and emotional intensity of the conflict in works that would influence European cultural traditions long after the political issues had been resolved. The heroic poetry composed during these campaigns preserved historical memories while creating artistic frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual courage and collective destiny. These cultural achievements demonstrated that artistic creativity could flourish even under the most challenging circumstances. The educational developments that emerged from cultural contact between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations created new possibilities for intellectual advancement that neither culture could have achieved in isolation. The combination of Anglo-Saxon literacy with Scandinavian oral traditions produced hybrid forms of knowledge preservation that enhanced both cultures' capacity for historical memory and cultural transmission. These intellectual syntheses would prove more durable than the political arrangements that originally brought the cultures into contact. The medical innovations that developed from treating the wounded of both armies advanced European understanding of surgical techniques and pharmaceutical applications in ways that benefited civilian populations long after military hostilities had ended. The exchange of healing knowledge between Anglo-Saxon monks and Scandinavian folk practitioners created new therapeutic approaches that combined the best elements from both traditions. These medical advances represented one of the most tangible benefits emerging from otherwise destructive conflicts. The navigational knowledge that Vikings brought to English waters introduced new techniques for coastal and riverine navigation that enhanced the maritime capabilities of all populations with access to these innovations. The combination of Scandinavian ocean-going expertise with Anglo-Saxon knowledge of local waterways created enhanced capacity for both commercial and military maritime operations. These navigational improvements would support expanded trade networks and exploration activities long after the immediate military applications had become irrelevant. The agricultural techniques that spread through cultural contact between the two populations often combined the best elements of both traditions to produce more efficient farming methods than either culture had previously employed. Scandinavian animal husbandry practices merged with Anglo-Saxon crop cultivation techniques to create agricultural systems that could support larger populations while requiring less intensive labor. These agricultural innovations helped regions recover from wartime disruptions more rapidly than traditional methods would have allowed. The craft production methods that emerged from the interaction between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian artisans created new technologies that surpassed the capabilities of either tradition, working in isolation. The combination of Anglo-Saxon decorative techniques with Scandinavian metalworking skills produced artistic and utilitarian objects of unprecedented quality and sophistication. These technological advances established new standards for craftsmanship that would influence European material culture for centuries. The commercial networks that developed, despite official hostility between the warring parties, created economic connections that sometimes proved stronger than political antagonisms. Merchants from both cultures found ways to maintain profitable relationships that transcended temporary military conflicts, establishing trade relationships that would outlast the political arrangements under which they originally developed. These commercial connections created vested interests in accommodation that sometimes influenced political decision-making in unexpected ways. The urban planning concepts that emerged from the construction of fortified settlements represented significant advances in medieval city design, as the practical requirements of defense were balanced against the economic needs of commercial and residential populations. The planned communities that resulted from these design innovations often proved more efficient and livable than settlements that had developed organically over longer periods. These urban planning advances would influence European town development throughout the medieval period. The transportation infrastructure that developed to support military operations created lasting improvements in communication and commerce throughout the regions where major campaigns occurred. The roads, bridges, and river improvements constructed for military purposes often continued serving civilian needs long after their original strategic importance had diminished. These infrastructure developments represented one of the most enduring positive legacies of otherwise destructive military campaigns. The administrative innovations that both sides developed to manage the complex requirements of extended warfare created new models of governmental organization that would influence European political development for centuries. The bureaucratic systems designed to coordinate military operations, manage civilian populations, and maintain economic production under wartime conditions often proved superior to traditional peacetime administrative methods. These governmental innovations established precedents for more efficient state organization that transcended their immediate military applications. As the spring of 874 progressed towards summer, the accumulated innovations, adaptations, and cultural exchanges that had emerged from 5 years of intensive warfare had created a fundamentally transformed social and political landscape throughout England. The simple narrative of conquest and resistance had evolved into a complex story of cultural synthesis, technological advancement, and institutional innovation that would influence European development far beyond the immediate resolution of military conflicts. The final campaigns that were about to unfold would determine not only the immediate political fate of Anglo-Saxon England, but also the long-term trajectory of European civilization itself. The lessons learned, the precedents established, and the cultural syntheses achieved during these years of conflict would echo through subsequent centuries of European history. The stage was set for climactic battles that would resolve immediate military questions while establishing foundations for future developments that neither side could fully anticipate. The summer of 874 would witness the culmination of everything that both cultures had learned about warfare, diplomacy, administration, and survival under the most challenging circumstances medieval Europe had yet experienced. The outcome of these final confrontations would create the political and cultural framework within which subsequent generations would build their own achievements and face their own challenges. The epic struggle between Alfred and the great heathen army was approaching its decisive moment, and the consequences would resonate through the halls of history for centuries to come. The decisive confrontation that would determine the survival of the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom began not with the clash of armies, but with a development so unexpected that it caught both sides completely unprepared. Intelligence reports reaching Alfred's court in early summer described something unprecedented in 5 years of Viking warfare. The great heathen army was dividing. For the first time since their arrival in England, the seemingly monolithic force that had conquered 3 kingdoms was fragmenting along lines that reflected deep-seated tensions within the Scandinavian coalition itself. The split emerged from a fundamental disagreement between Viking leaders about the ultimate objectives of their English campaigns. One faction, led by Halfdan Ragnarsson, advocated for permanent settlement and the establishment of Scandinavian kingdoms that could provide long-term prosperity for their followers. This group had grown weary of constant warfare and desired to transform their military conquests into stable political entities that could generate wealth through taxation and trade rather than plunder and tribute. The opposing faction, commanded by Guthrum the Old, remained committed to traditional Viking objectives of conquest and expansion, viewing England merely as a stepping stone toward greater prizes in continental Europe. These warriors argued that permanent settlement would weaken their military effectiveness by transforming fierce raiders into complacent farmers, ultimately making them vulnerable to counterattack by enemies who retained their martial vigor. The philosophical divide between these approaches reflected broader changes occurring throughout Scandinavian society as successful raiders accumulated sufficient wealth to consider alternatives to perpetual warfare. The geographical division that resulted from this strategic disagreement saw Halfdan leading approximately half the great heathen army northward toward Northumbria, where his forces could establish permanent settlements in the rich agricultural lands of Yorkshire. Meanwhile, Guthrum retained control over the southern portions of the army and prepared to complete the conquest of Wessex as the final step in his planned expansion toward Frankish territories. This division of forces created the first realistic opportunity for Anglo-Saxon resistance in years. Alfred's response to this unexpected development demonstrated the strategic acumen that would mark him as one of medieval Europe's greatest military leaders. Rather than immediately attacking either weakened Viking force, he chose to exploit the political tensions between the 2 factions through carefully calibrated diplomatic overtures designed to prevent their reunification. His envoys carried messages to both Viking leaders, suggesting that accommodation with Wessex might serve their respective interests better than continued cooperation with their former allies. The negotiations that Alfred initiated with Guthrum represented a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy, offering the Viking leader precisely what he most desired, while creating conditions that would preserve Wessex's essential independence. The proposed agreement would recognise Guthrum's conquest of East Anglia and portions of Mercia, in exchange for his acknowledgement of Alfred's sovereignty over Wessex and his commitment to prevent other Viking forces from using his territories as bases for attacks against Anglo-Saxon lands. The religious dimensions of these negotiations added complexity that reflected the sophisticated theological understanding both leaders had developed through years of cultural contact. Alfred's proposal that Guthrum convert to Christianity was not merely a symbolic gesture, but a practical political arrangement that would provide the Viking leader with legitimacy among his Anglo-Saxon subjects, while creating spiritual bonds that might prove stronger than temporary military alliances. The conversion process would also require Guthrum to spend extended periods at Alfred's court, creating opportunities for developing personal relationships that could transcend political calculations. The summer campaigns of 874 unfolded against this backdrop of diplomatic maneuvering, as both sides tested their military options while exploring possibilities for negotiated settlement. Alfred's forces, operating with greater strategic freedom than they had enjoyed since the beginning of the Viking invasions, launched a series of carefully coordinated attacks designed to demonstrate Wessex's continued military viability while avoiding decisive engagements that might jeopardize ongoing negotiations. The tactical innovations that Alfred employed during these campaigns reflected everything he had learned about Viking warfare through 5 years of bitter experience. His forces adopted hit-and-run tactics that mirrored Viking methods while exploiting their superior knowledge of local terrain and population support. The Burr system that Alfred had developed provided secure bases from which these operations could be launched, while offering refuge for civilians threatened by Viking reprisals. The psychological warfare that both sides employed during this period demonstrated how thoroughly medieval conflict had evolved beyond simple military confrontation to encompass sophisticated manipulation of popular opinion and enemy morale. Alfred's propagandists spread carefully crafted messages throughout Viking-controlled territories, suggesting that the division of the great heathen army reflected divine displeasure with pagan conquest of Christian lands. These religious interpretations of military events proved particularly effective among Anglo-Saxon populations who had begun to despair of divine intervention on their behalf. The economic warfare that accompanied these military and diplomatic maneuvers revealed the extent to which both sides had learned to exploit their enemies' vulnerabilities through systematic disruption of trade networks and resource flows. Alfred's forces concentrated on intercepting tribute caravans travelling between Viking territories, while Guthrum's raiders targeted the agricultural infrastructure that supported Wessex's military resistance. These economic attacks often proved more decisive than battlefield victories in determining the strategic balance between the competing forces. The technological exchanges that continued despite active hostilities demonstrated the complex nature of cultural contact under conditions of military conflict. Viking metalworkers captured during raids often found themselves employed in Alfred's workshops, where their expertise in weapon manufacturing contributed to improving Anglo-Saxon military capabilities. Similarly, Anglo-Saxon craftsmen in Viking territories sometimes gained access to Scandinavian techniques that enhanced their productive capacity. The intelligence networks that both sides had developed reached unprecedented sophistication during this period, as the importance of accurate information about enemy intentions and capabilities became crucial for both military and diplomatic success. Alfred's agents operated throughout Viking territories, gathering details about internal divisions and military preparations, while Guthrum's spies monitored developments within Wessex that might indicate weakness or opportunity. The logistical challenges facing both armies during these extended operations required innovative solutions that pushed medieval military administration to new levels of complexity. The coordination of supply trains across hostile territory, the establishment of secure communication networks, and the maintenance of fighting effectiveness among forces operating far from their bases all demanded organizational capabilities that had rarely been tested under such challenging conditions. The cultural transformations occurring within both societies reflected the profound impact that 5 years of intensive warfare had produced on traditional social structures and value systems. Anglo-Saxon nobles who had survived the Viking onslaught often possessed military experience and strategic understanding that surpassed their ancestors, while Scandinavian warriors who had spent years in England had developed appreciation for Anglo-Saxon legal traditions and administrative practices. The religious syncretism that continued developing, despite official antagonism between Christian and pagan communities, created unexpected opportunities for cultural accommodation that transcended immediate political conflicts. Some Viking settlers had begun adopting Christian practices while maintaining traditional beliefs, creating hybrid spiritual systems that facilitated communication between formerly hostile populations. The legal innovations that emerged in areas of mixed population established precedents for resolving disputes between parties operating under different cultural traditions. These hybrid juridical systems often proved more effective than either Anglo-Saxon or Scandinavian law in addressing the practical needs of ethnically diverse communities, creating models that would influence European legal development for centuries. The architectural achievements of this period reflected the massive investment in defensive construction that both sides had undertaken to protect their territorial gains and strategic positions. The fortifications built during 874 incorporated design principles learned from 5 years of siege warfare, creating defensive systems that represented significant advances in military engineering. The educational opportunities that arose from cultural contact enabled knowledge transfer that benefited both societies in unexpected ways. Anglo-Saxon scholars gained access to Scandinavian historical traditions, while Viking settlers learned literacy skills that enhanced their administrative capabilities. These intellectual exchanges created new possibilities for cultural development that neither society could have achieved in isolation. The commercial relationships that developed despite official hostility between the warring parties often proved more durable than the political arrangements under which they originally emerged. Merchants from both cultures found ways to maintain profitable trade connections that transcended temporary military conflicts, establishing economic networks that would outlast the immediate political resolution of their disputes. The agricultural innovations that spread through regions of cultural contact combined techniques from both traditions to create farming methods that could support larger populations while requiring less intensive labor. These technological advances helped communities recover from wartime disruptions more rapidly than traditional approaches would have permitted, demonstrating the practical benefits that could emerge from cultural synthesis. The medical knowledge that accumulated from treating wounded warriors of both armies, advanced European understanding of surgical procedures and pharmaceutical applications in ways that benefited civilian populations throughout the affected regions. The exchange of healing traditions between Anglo-Saxon monks and Scandinavian folk practitioners created new therapeutic approaches that enhanced medical capabilities for both cultures. The urban planning concepts that emerged from constructing fortified settlements during this period represented significant advances in medieval city design, as defensive requirements were balanced against economic needs of commercial and residential populations. These planned communities often proved more efficient and livable than settlements that had developed organically over longer periods. The transportation infrastructure created to support military operations produced lasting improvements in communication and commerce throughout regions where major campaigns occurred. The roads, bridges, and river improvements built for strategic purposes continued serving civilian needs long after their original military importance had diminished. The administrative systems developed to coordinate complex military operations, while maintaining civilian government under wartime conditions often proved superior to traditional peacetime governmental methods. These bureaucratic innovations established new models for state organization that would influence European political development throughout the medieval period. The literary productions of this era captured both the heroism and tragedy of the conflict, while preserving historical memories that would shape cultural identity for generations. The epic poetry composed during these campaigns created artistic frameworks for understanding relationships between individual courage and collective destiny that transcended immediate political considerations. The technological advances that emerged from the pressure of constant innovation under military necessity established new standards for craftsmanship and engineering that influenced European material culture long after the immediate conflicts had been resolved. The combination of different cultural traditions under conditions of intensive competition produced hybrid technologies that surpassed the capabilities of either tradition working independently. The diplomatic precedents established through negotiations between Alfred and various Viking leaders created new models for international relations that recognized the legitimacy of cultural differences while establishing frameworks for peaceful coexistence. These diplomatic innovations would influence European treaty-making and conflict resolution for centuries to come. As the autumn of 874 approached, the complex web of military, diplomatic, economic, and cultural interactions that had developed between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations had created possibilities for resolution that transcended simple conquest or resistance. The accumulated experience of both sides had generated innovative approaches to governance, law, commerce, and social organization that offered alternatives to perpetual warfare. The negotiations between Alfred and Guthrum reached their crucial phase as both leaders recognized that the costs of continued conflict had begun to outweigh potential benefits. The resources required to maintain large armies indefinitely strained both societies beyond sustainable limits, while the cultural exchanges that had occurred during 5 years of interaction had created shared interest that might support negotiated settlement. The Treaty of Wedmore, concluded in late 874, represented one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated diplomatic achievements. establishing principles for cultural coexistence that would influence international relations for centuries. The agreement recognized the political reality of Scandinavian conquest while preserving Anglo-Saxon independence, creating a framework for peaceful interaction between populations that retained distinct cultural identities. The religious ceremony that accompanied Guthrum's conversion to Christianity symbolized the complex cultural synthesis that had emerged from years of conflict and accommodation. The Viking leader's adoption of the Christian name Athelstan represented more than simple political expediency, reflecting genuine appreciation for Anglo-Saxon cultural achievements that had developed through prolonged interaction with English populations. The territorial arrangements established by the treaty created the political framework known to history as the Danelaw, recognizing Scandinavian authority over approximately half of England while guaranteeing Wessex's continued independence. This division reflected military realities while establishing boundaries that both sides could accept as legitimate and defensible. The legal provisions of the treaty addressed practical concerns about governance in ethnically mixed populations, establishing procedures for resolving disputes between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian communities. These juridical innovations created precedents for managing cultural diversity that would influence European law throughout the medieval period. The economic clauses of the agreement facilitated renewed commercial activity between formerly hostile territories, recognizing that mutual prosperity required cooperation rather than continued exploitation. The restoration of trade networks disrupted by years of warfare provided both sides with economic benefits that reinforced their political commitment to maintaining peace. The military arrangements specified in the treaty established procedures for mutual defense against external threats while preventing either side from using force against the other. These security provisions created stability that enabled both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations to focus on reconstruction and development rather than continued preparation for warfare. The cultural accommodations negotiated between Alfred and Guthrum recognized the right of both populations to maintain their traditional customs and beliefs within their respective territories. This principle of cultural autonomy prevented the assimilation that might have threatened group identity, while encouraging peaceful interaction between different communities. The administrative structures established to implement the treaty created hybrid governmental systems that combined Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian institutional practices. These innovative approaches to public administration often proved more effective than either tradition could have achieved independently, establishing models that would influence European political development for generations. The Treaty of Wedmore marked not the end of Viking activity in England, but rather the beginning of a new phase characterized by settlement, assimilation, and cultural synthesis rather than conquest and resistance. The foundations laid during these negotiations would support centuries of peaceful development that transformed both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian societies in ways that neither could have anticipated when their conflict began. The success of these diplomatic arrangements demonstrated that medieval conflicts need not end in complete victory or defeat, but could produce negotiated settlements that recognized the legitimate interests of all parties while creating frameworks for continued cultural development. The precedents established at Wedmore would influence European diplomacy throughout the medieval period and beyond. The legacy of the Treaty of Wedmore rippled across the medieval world like stones cast into still water, creating waves of consequence that would reshape not only England, but the entire trajectory of European civilization. As autumn deepened into winter, the practical implementation of the agreement revealed complexities that neither Alfred nor Guthrum had fully anticipated during their negotiations. The creation of two distinct yet interconnected realms within a single island required unprecedented innovations in governance, law, and cultural accommodation that would test the wisdom of both leaders. The establishment of the Danelaw boundary created immediate challenges as communities found themselves divided by political lines that bore little relationship to existing social, economic, or family connections. Villages that had traded freely for generations suddenly discovered themselves on opposite sides of an international border, while extended families faced separation by political arrangements that recognized no kinship obligations. The resolution of these practical difficulties required constant negotiation and compromise from local officials who possessed limited guidance about how to implement revolutionary political concepts. The administrative fusion that emerged along the Danelaw frontier produced governmental innovations that combined the hierarchical efficiency of Anglo-Saxon bureaucracy with the democratic participation characteristic of Scandinavian assemblies. Local courts began incorporating elements from both legal traditions, creating hybrid procedures that often proved more equitable and effective than either system operating independently. These judicial experiments established precedents for legal pluralism that would influence European jurisprudence long after the immediate political arrangements had evolved beyond recognition. The economic integration that followed the treaty's implementation demonstrated how quickly former enemies could develop mutually beneficial relationships when political stability replaced military uncertainty. Anglo-Saxon merchants discovered eager markets for their agricultural products and manufactured goods in Scandinavian territories, while Viking traders found profitable opportunities for their imported luxuries and specialized crafts among English populations. The restoration of commercial networks disrupted by warfare brought prosperity that reinforced both sides' commitment to maintaining peaceful relations. The cultural exchanges that accelerated under conditions of political stability produced remarkable syntheses in art, architecture, and intellectual achievement. Anglo-Saxon monasteries began incorporating Scandinavian decorative motifs into their manuscript illuminations, while Viking craftsmen adopted Christian symbolism in their metalwork and stone carving. These artistic fusions created distinctive styles that reflected the unique historical circumstances of their creation, while establishing aesthetic traditions that would endure for centuries. The religious accommodations that developed within the Danelaw revealed the practical flexibility that characterized medieval Christianity when faced with pastoral challenges among diverse populations. Anglo-Saxon clergy serving Scandinavian converts learned to adapt their theological instruction to address concerns arising from traditional Norse mythology while maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy that satisfied ecclesiastical authorities. These pastoral innovations created new approaches to Christian education that proved valuable throughout Europe as the Church encountered other pagan populations seeking conversion. The linguistic transformations that occurred in regions of intensive cultural contact produced the dialectical variations that would eventually contribute to the richness of the English language. Anglo-Saxon vocabulary absorbed hundreds of Scandinavian terms related to law life, while Norse, government, agriculture, and daily speakers adopted Christian terminology and Latin scholarly expressions from their Anglo-Saxon neighbours. These linguistic exchanges created communication patterns that facilitated cultural understanding while preserving distinct ethnic identities. The educational opportunities that emerged from cultural synthesis enabled knowledge transfer that advanced both civilizations beyond what either could have achieved independently. Viking oral traditions preserved historical memories and mythological knowledge that enriched Anglo-Saxon understanding of Northern European heritage, while Scandinavian exposure to Latin literacy opened access to classical learning and Christian scholarship. These intellectual exchanges accelerated cultural development in ways that benefited both societies for generations. The technological innovations that resulted from combining Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian expertise produced advances in agriculture, craftsmanship, and engineering that enhanced productivity throughout both realms. Viking knowledge of navigation and shipbuilding merged with Anglo-Saxon understanding of river management and coastal defense to create superior maritime capabilities. Similarly, the fusion of different metalworking traditions produced weapons and tools of unprecedented quality and effectiveness. The social transformations that accompanied political settlement created new opportunities for individual advancement that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. Successful Anglo-Saxon warriors could gain recognition and reward in Viking service, while talented Scandinavian administrators found advancement opportunities within Anglo-Saxon governmental structures. These patterns of social mobility created personal connections across cultural lines that reinforced political agreements with individual relationships and shared interests. The military cooperation that developed between formerly hostile armies demonstrated how quickly practical necessities could overcome historical antagonisms when mutual benefits became apparent. Joint defense against external threats required coordination between Anglo-Saxon and Viking forces, creating institutional relationships that fostered professional respect and personal friendship among warriors who had recently fought each other. These military partnerships established precedents for international cooperation that would influence medieval warfare for centuries. The architectural legacy of this period reflected the massive construction projects undertaken to implement the new political arrangements. The fortifications that defined the Danelaw boundary incorporated design elements from both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian traditions, creating defensive systems that were both militarily effective and symbolically meaningful to diverse populations. Similarly, the churches, halls, and administrative buildings constructed during this era combined architectural elements from different cultural traditions to create distinctive hybrid styles. The agricultural developments that occurred under conditions of political stability enabled both realms to recover from wartime devastation, while implementing improvements that increased productivity and population carrying capacity. The combination of Anglo-Saxon crop cultivation techniques with Scandinavian animal husbandry practices created farming systems that could support larger populations while requiring less intensive labor. These agricultural advances provided the economic foundation for the cultural achievements that characterized the following decades. The commercial networks that developed between the Danelaw and Wessex created economic relationships that extended far beyond the British Isles to connect English markets with Scandinavian trade routes reaching Russia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Anglo-Saxon agricultural products and manufactured goods found eager buyers in northern European markets, while exotic luxuries from distant lands became available to English consumers through Viking commercial connections. These expanded trade networks brought unprecedented prosperity to both realms, while creating economic incentives for maintaining peaceful relations. The legal innovations that emerged from managing ethnically diverse populations established principles for cultural accommodation that would influence European law throughout the medieval period. The recognition of different legal traditions within a single political framework required sophisticated approaches to jurisdiction and procedure that balanced respect for cultural autonomy with the need for consistent governance. These juridical experiments created precedents for managing diversity that proved valuable as European societies became increasingly complex and cosmopolitan. The diplomatic precedents established through the Anglo-Saxon and Viking accommodation influenced international relations throughout medieval Europe, as other kingdoms faced similar challenges from Scandinavian expansion. The success of negotiated settlement, rather than total conquest or resistance, demonstrated alternative approaches to resolving cultural conflicts that could preserve the legitimate interests of all parties while creating frameworks for continued development. These diplomatic innovations established new models for international relations that recognize cultural differences as potential sources of strength rather than inevitable causes of conflict. The intellectual achievements that flourished under conditions of cultural synthesis demonstrated how diversity could stimulate creativity and innovation in ways that homogeneous societies might not achieve. The combination of Anglo-Saxon scholarly traditions with Scandinavian oral culture created new approaches to historical writing, legal analysis, and literary composition that enriched both traditions while establishing distinctive intellectual achievements. These scholarly innovations contributed to the broader European intellectual renaissance that would characterize the later medieval period. The urban development that occurred in both realms reflected the prosperity and stability that followed political settlement, as towns and cities expanded beyond their wartime fortifications to accommodate growing populations and increasing commercial activity. The planned communities that emerged during this period incorporated lessons learned from military architecture while addressing civilian needs for markets, workshops, and residential areas. These urban innovations established patterns of city development that would influence European town planning for generations. The transportation infrastructure that was developed to support increased trade and communication between the two realms created lasting improvements in roads, bridges, and river navigation that benefited both civilian and military purposes. The systematic improvement of communication networks enabled more efficient governance and commerce, while providing strategic advantages in case military cooperation became necessary for mutual defense against external threats. The cultural institutions that developed to serve ethnically diverse populations created new models for education, entertainment, and social organization that accommodated different traditions while fostering shared identity and common purpose. Schools that taught both Anglo-Saxon literacy and Scandinavian oral traditions prepared students to function effectively in multicultural environments, while festivals and celebrations that incorporated elements from both cultures created shared experiences that reinforced political unity. The religious developments that occurred within the Danelaw produced distinctive forms of Christianity that reflected the unique historical circumstances of Scandinavian conversion while maintaining doctrinal connection with broader European Christianity. The churches that were built during this period incorporated architectural and decorative elements from both traditions, creating sacred spaces that felt familiar to converts while expressing their new religious identity. These religious innovations demonstrated how Christianity could adapt to different cultural contexts while preserving its essential theological content. The artistic achievements of this era reflected the creative possibilities that emerged when different aesthetic traditions encountered each other under conditions of mutual respect and peaceful competition. The distinctive decorative styles that developed in the Danelaw combined Anglo-Saxon manuscript illumination techniques with Scandinavian metalwork traditions to create artistic expressions that were neither purely English nor purely Viking, but represented something entirely new and uniquely beautiful. The literary productions of this period captured both the heroic legacy of the Viking Age and the hope for peaceful development that characterized the new political arrangements. The poems and chronicles composed during these years preserved historical memories while articulating visions of cultural synthesis that inspired both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations to embrace their shared future, rather than remaining trapped by past conflicts. As the 870s progressed into the 880s, the success of the Danelaw experiment became increasingly apparent as both realms experienced unprecedented prosperity and cultural development under conditions of political stability and mutual cooperation. The innovations in governance, law, commerce, and culture that had emerged from the accommodation between Alfred and Guthrum provided models that would influence European development for centuries, while demonstrating that medieval conflicts need not end in complete victory or defeat, but could produce negotiated settlements that benefited all parties. The transformation of England from a land torn by conquest and resistance into a complex political entity that successfully managed cultural diversity while maintaining political unity represented one of the most remarkable achievements of medieval European civilization. The foundations laid during these crucial decades would support centuries of continued development that would ultimately contribute to England's emergence as a major European power, while preserving the cultural richness that emerged from the synthesis of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian traditions. The lessons learned from this successful accommodation would prove invaluable as other European societies face similar challenges from cultural contact, population movement, and political transformation. The precedents established in England demonstrated that diversity could become a source of strength rather than division when appropriate institutional frameworks were created to channel cultural differences toward constructive purposes rather than destructive conflict. The legacy of the Viking Age in England thus extended far beyond the immediate military and political consequences of Scandinavian expansion to encompass fundamental contributions to European civilization in law, governance, culture, and international relations. The accommodation achieved between Alfred and Guthrum represented not merely the end of one historical era, but the beginning of new possibilities for human organization and cultural development that would influence the trajectory of Western civilization for centuries to come. The ripple effects of this unprecedented accommodation spread far beyond the shores of Britain, as word of the successful treaty reached the halls of Frankish kings and the longhouses of Danish Jarls with equal fascination and concern. In the monasteries of Ireland, where Viking raids had become an almost seasonal occurrence, monks bent over their illuminated manuscripts, paused to consider whether negotiation might prove more effective than prayer alone. Along the windswept coasts of Scotland, Pictish chieftains who had spent decades repelling Norse incursions began contemplating whether the English model might offer alternatives to perpetual warfare. The transformation of Guthrum from pagan war leader to Christian king named Athelstan created theological ripples that reached the furthest corners of Christendom. In the papal courts of Rome, learned clerics debated whether mass conversion of Viking armies represented divine miracle or political convenience, while in the monasteries of Francia, chroniclers struggled to comprehend how barbarian conquerors could so readily adopt the faith of their former enemies. The speed and apparent sincerity of Scandinavian religious conversion challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between cultural identity and spiritual belief. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, the success of English settlement created unprecedented pressures within Scandinavian society itself. Young warriors who had dreamed of winning glory and gold through overseas adventure now faced a transformed landscape of opportunity. The old model of seasonal raiding, followed by triumphant return to ancestral halls, gave way to permanent emigration and the establishment of new lives in distant lands. Families faced agonizing decisions about whether to remain in familiar territories or seek their fortunes in the expanding Viking territories that now offered legitimate alternatives to traditional forms of advancement. The demographic shifts that resulted from large-scale Scandinavian settlement in England created corresponding changes throughout the northern homeland. Entire regions found themselves depopulated of their most ambitious and capable young men, while the influx of English silver from tribute and trade fundamentally altered traditional economic relationships. The warrior culture that had glorified death in battle gradually adapted to accommodate the reality that successful raiders now sought to establish dynasties rather than achieve heroic endings. The technological exchanges that flowed along these new pathways of communication accelerated innovation on both sides of the North Sea. Anglo-Saxon shipwrights gained access to advanced Scandinavian navigation techniques that had enabled Vikings to reach Iceland and Greenland, while Norse craftsmen incorporated English metalworking methods that produced superior weapons and tools. Agricultural knowledge moved freely between communities, as Scandinavian farmers learned English crop rotation methods, while Anglo-Saxon peasants adopted Viking techniques for managing livestock through harsh winters. The commercial networks that emerged from political accommodation created unprecedented opportunities for long-distance trade that connected English markets with exotic goods from Russia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Viking merchants, who had previously focused on raiding and tribute collection, discovered that peaceful commerce could generate more reliable and sustainable profits than warfare. The establishment of permanent trading posts along major rivers created infrastructure that would support economic development for generations, while providing alternatives to military adventure for ambitious young Scandinavians. The legal frameworks that developed to govern these expanding commercial relationships required sophisticated approaches to contract enforcement and dispute resolution across cultural boundaries. Anglo-Saxon legal traditions that emphasized written documentation merged with Scandinavian customs that relied on oral agreements witnessed by community assemblies. The hybrid juridical systems that emerged often proved more flexible and effective than either tradition operating independently, creating precedents that would influence European commercial law throughout the medieval period. The educational institutions that developed to serve increasingly diverse populations faced unprecedented challenges in preserving cultural traditions while preparing students for life in multicultural environments. Monastic schools that had traditionally focused on Latin scholarship and Christian theology found themselves teaching Norse language and mythology to Anglo-Saxon students, while Scandinavian communities established their own educational centres that combine traditional oral instruction with newfound literacy skills. The artistic achievements that flourished under conditions of cultural synthesis reflected the creative possibilities that emerged when different aesthetic traditions encountered each other through peaceful interaction rather than violent conquest. The manuscript illuminations produced in Danelaw monasteries combined Anglo-Saxon decorative techniques with Scandinavian mythological themes to create entirely new forms of visual expression. Similarly, the stone crosses erected in newly Christianized Viking territories incorporated traditional Norse symbols within Christian iconographic frameworks. The architectural innovations that emerged from building churches for Scandinavian converts revealed how successfully different cultural traditions could be integrated within unified aesthetic visions. The churches constructed during this period often featured Scandinavian timber construction techniques adapted to Anglo-Saxon stone masonry traditions, creating buildings that felt familiar to converts while expressing their new religious identity. These architectural syntheses demonstrated how physical structures could embody cultural accommodation in ways that reinforce political agreements through daily experience. The linguistic developments that occurred in regions of intensive cultural contact created dialectical variations that enriched communication possibilities while preserving distinct ethnic identities. The absorption of Scandinavian vocabulary into Anglo-Saxon speech patterns occurred so naturally that contemporary speakers often remained unaware of the foreign origins of words they used daily. Terms related to law, government, navigation, and agriculture flowed freely between languages, creating shared vocabularies that facilitated understanding across cultural boundaries. The religious practices that developed within converted Viking communities demonstrated remarkable creativity in adapting Christian rituals to address spiritual needs arising from traditional Norse beliefs. The seasonal festivals that had honored pagan deities gradually transformed into Christian celebrations that maintained familiar elements while directing worship toward the new faith. These liturgical innovations created forms of Christianity that felt authentic to converts while remaining doctrinally acceptable to ecclesiastical authorities. The military cooperation that developed between formerly hostile armies created professional relationships that transcended ethnic divisions while maintaining distinct tactical traditions. Anglo-Saxon and Viking warriors serving together in defense against external threats learned to appreciate each other's combat techniques and strategic thinking. The exchange of military knowledge that resulted from these partnerships enhanced the effectiveness of both forces while creating personal bonds that reinforced political alliances. The family relationships that developed through intermarriage between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations created new forms of kinship that bridged cultural boundaries while preserving connections to ancestral traditions. Children born of these mixed unions often served as cultural interpreters who could navigate both communities with equal facility. These individuals frequently achieved positions of influence that enabled them to facilitate continued cooperation between their respective ethnic groups. The economic specialization that emerged from cultural contact enabled both communities to focus on activities where they possessed comparative advantages while trading for goods and services that others could provide more efficiently. Anglo-Saxon agricultural expertise complemented Scandinavian maritime capabilities, creating economic relationships that benefited both parties while reducing incentives for conflict. The prosperity that resulted from these cooperative arrangements provided tangible evidence of accommodation's benefits. The territorial administration that developed to govern ethnically diverse populations required innovative approaches to local government that balanced respect for cultural autonomy with the need for consistent policy implementation. The administrative systems that emerged often incorporated elements from both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian governmental traditions, creating hybrid institutions that proved more effective than either system operating independently. These governmental innovations established models that would influence European political development throughout the medieval period. The diplomatic relationships that extended beyond the immediate Anglo-Saxon and Viking accommodation created networks of international cooperation that enhanced security and prosperity for all participants. The success of negotiated settlement in England encouraged other European rulers to consider diplomatic alternatives to military confrontation when facing similar challenges. These diplomatic precedents established new expectations about international behavior that gradually reduced the frequency and intensity of medieval conflicts. The cultural institutions that developed to preserve and transmit knowledge across ethnic boundaries created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual development that neither community could have achieved independently. Libraries that combined Anglo-Saxon manuscript collections with Scandinavian oral traditions created comprehensive repositories of human knowledge that advanced scholarship throughout Northern Europe. These intellectual achievements demonstrated how cultural diversity could stimulate creativity and innovation when appropriate institutional frameworks channeled differences toward constructive purposes. The urban development that occurred under conditions of political stability enabled both realms to invest in infrastructure projects that enhanced economic productivity while improving quality of life for all residents. The planned communities that emerged during this period incorporated lessons learned from military architecture while addressing civilian needs for markets, workshops, and residential areas. These urban innovations established patterns of city development that would influence European town planning for generations, while creating physical environments that reinforced social cooperation. The transportation networks that were established to support increased trade and communication created lasting improvements in connectivity that benefited both civilian and military purposes. The systematic development of roads, bridges, and river navigation enabled more efficient movement of people, goods, and information throughout both realms. These infrastructure investments provided foundations for continued economic growth while creating strategic capabilities that could support mutual defense if external threats emerged. The agricultural innovations that resulted from combining different farming traditions enhanced productivity while reducing labor requirements, enabling both communities to support larger populations with greater prosperity. The integration of Anglo-Saxon crop cultivation methods with Scandinavian animal husbandry techniques created farming systems that proved more resilient to environmental challenges while generating surpluses that could support specialized crafts and commercial activities. The medical knowledge that accumulated from treating injuries and illnesses affecting ethnically diverse populations combined therapeutic traditions from both cultures to create more effective approaches to healthcare. The exchange of healing practices between Anglo-Saxon monastics and Scandinavian folk practitioners produced hybrid medical systems that often proved superior to either tradition operating independently. These medical advances improved survival rates and quality of life for all community members, while demonstrating practical benefits of cultural cooperation. The technological developments that emerged from combining different craft traditions established new standards for manufacturing quality that influenced production throughout Northern Europe. The fusion of Anglo-Saxon decorative techniques with Scandinavian metalworking expertise created products that surpassed the capabilities of either tradition working independently. These technological advances enhanced both communities' competitive advantages in international markets, while providing tangible evidence of accommodation's benefits. The scholarly achievements that flourished under conditions of intellectual freedom and cultural exchange advanced human knowledge in ways that benefited all European civilization. The historical chronicles, legal commentaries, and philosophical treatises produced during this period combined Anglo-Saxon literacy with Scandinavian oral traditions to create comprehensive accounts of human experience. These intellectual contributions established foundations for continued cultural development while preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during periods of conflict. As the final decades of the 9th century unfolded, the accommodation achieved between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations had created a model of successful cultural integration that would influence European development for centuries to come. The institutions, practices, and relationships that emerged from this historic compromise demonstrated that medieval conflicts need not end in total victory or complete defeat, but could produce negotiated settlements that preserved the legitimate interests of all parties, while creating frameworks for continued prosperity and development. The transformation of England from a land devastated by conquest and resistance into a complex political entity that successfully managed cultural diversity while maintaining unity represented one of the most remarkable achievements of medieval European civilization. The precedents established during these crucial decades would provide guidance for future generations facing similar challenges, while demonstrating that human societies possess the capacity to transcend their divisions through wisdom, courage, and mutual respect. The legacy of this successful accommodation extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence the broader trajectory of European civilization. The principles of cultural tolerance, diplomatic negotiation, and institutional innovation that emerged from the Anglo-Saxon and Viking experience would prove invaluable as other societies encountered similar challenges from population movement, cultural contact, and political transformation. The foundations laid during this pivotal period would support centuries of continued development that would ultimately contribute to Europe's emergence as a major force in world civilization. The reverberations of this extraordinary accommodation between two warrior cultures spread across the medieval world like ripples from a stone cast into dark waters, reaching shores that neither Alfred nor Guthrum could have imagined during their fateful negotiations. In the halls of Constantinople, where Byzantine emperors had long employed Varangian guards drawn from the same Scandinavian stock as England's Vikings, court officials observed with keen interest how barbarian warriors could transform themselves into legitimate rulers without losing their martial effectiveness. The implications for imperial policy toward other northern peoples required careful consideration by administrators who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless kingdoms along their frontiers. The monasteries of Ireland, where Viking raids had become as predictable as the changing seasons, found themselves grappling with theological questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about divine providence and human redemption. If pagan raiders could genuinely embrace Christianity and establish just rule over Christian populations, what did this suggest about God's mysterious purposes in permitting such devastation? The scholarly debates that emerged from these contemplations would influence Irish ecclesiastical thinking for generations, creating new approaches to missionary activity that emphasized accommodation rather than confrontation when dealing with non-Christian peoples. Meanwhile, along the contested frontiers of Francia, Carolingian nobles watched the English developments with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. The success of negotiated settlement offered hope for resolving their own Viking problems through diplomacy rather than endless warfare. Yet the legitimization of Scandinavian territorial gains threatened to encourage further expansion by ambitious Norse leaders who might interpret English accommodation as evidence of Christian weakness. The delicate balance between maintaining defensive capabilities while exploring diplomatic possibilities required wisdom that few contemporary rulers possessed in sufficient measure. The demographic transformations that followed large-scale Scandinavian settlement created unprecedented social mobility within Viking society itself, as successful colonists accumulated wealth and status that elevated them above traditional hierarchies based solely on birth and martial prowess. Young men who might have remained minor figures in their ancestral communities found themselves governing substantial territories and commanding respect from populations far larger than any Scandinavian chieftain had previously ruled. These opportunities for advancement attracted additional emigrants from throughout the northern world, creating a continuous flow of ambitious individuals seeking their fortunes in the expanding Viking territories. The technological exchanges that accelerated under conditions of peaceful coexistence revolutionized agricultural practices throughout both realms, as Anglo-Saxon farmers learned Scandinavian techniques for managing livestock through harsh winters, while Viking settlers adopted English methods for maximizing crop yields from limited arable land. The heavy ploughs that had enabled Anglo-Saxon cultivation of clay soils found new applications in Scandinavian territories, while Norse knowledge of animal breeding improved livestock quality throughout England. These agricultural innovations provided the economic foundation for population growth that would characterize both societies for centuries. The commercial networks that emerged from political stabilization created unprecedented opportunities for long-distance trade that connected English markets with exotic goods from the furthest reaches of the Viking world. Merchants traveling the great river routes of Russia brought furs, amber, and silver from territories stretching to the Arctic Circle, while Islamic coins and Byzantine silks arrived through trading connections that extended to Constantinople and Baghdad. The prosperity generated by these expanded commercial relationships provided both rulers with resources necessary for maintaining the administrative apparatus required to govern their complex realms. The legal innovations that developed to address disputes arising from cultural contact established precedents for managing diversity that would influence European jurisprudence throughout the medieval period and beyond. The recognition that different communities might legitimately operate under distinct legal traditions, while participating in shared political structures, required sophisticated approaches to jurisdiction that balanced cultural autonomy with governmental unity. These juridical experiments created frameworks for managing complexity that proved valuable as European societies became increasingly diverse and interconnected. The educational transformations that occurred as formerly hostile populations learned to coexist created new approaches to knowledge preservation and transmission that enriched both cultural traditions. Anglo-Saxon monasteries began recording Scandinavian oral histories and mythological traditions, while Viking communities established schools that taught literacy alongside traditional martial and navigational skills. The synthesis of written and oral learning traditions produced educational methods that proved more comprehensive and effective than either approach operating independently. The artistic achievements that flourished under conditions of cultural synthesis demonstrated how creative expression could transcend ethnic boundaries while preserving distinctive aesthetic traditions. The illuminated manuscripts produced in Danelaw scriptoriums combined Anglo-Saxon decorative techniques with Scandinavian symbolic motifs to create entirely new forms of visual art. Similarly, the stone sculptures that adorned churches in newly Christianized Viking territories incorporated traditional Norse imagery within Christian iconographic frameworks, creating sacred art that spoke to converts in familiar visual languages while expressing their transformed spiritual understanding. The architectural innovations that emerged from constructing buildings for ethnically diverse populations revealed how physical structures could embody cultural accommodation through design elements that honored multiple traditions simultaneously. The churches built for Scandinavian converts often featured timber construction techniques derived from traditional longhouse architecture, adapted to serve Christian liturgical requirements while maintaining aesthetic connections to ancestral building practices. These architectural syntheses created sacred spaces that felt familiar to converts, while clearly expressing their new religious identity. The linguistic developments that occurred in regions of intensive cultural contact produced dialectical variations that would eventually contribute to the remarkable richness of the English language. The natural absorption of Scandinavian vocabulary into Anglo-Saxon speech patterns occurred so seamlessly that many borrowings became virtually invisible to speakers who used foreign terms daily without conscious awareness of their origins. Words related to law, government, family relationships, and everyday activities flowed freely between languages, creating shared vocabularies that facilitated communication across ethnic boundaries. The religious practices that evolved within converted Viking communities demonstrated remarkable creativity in adapting Christian worship to address spiritual needs arising from traditional Norse beliefs and customs. The seasonal celebrations that had previously honored pagan deities gradually transformed into Christian festivals that maintained familiar ritual elements while directing worship toward the new faith. These liturgical innovations created forms of Christianity that felt authentic to converts while remaining doctrinally acceptable to ecclesiastical authorities who understood the pastoral challenges involved in mass conversion of adult populations. The military cooperation that developed between formerly hostile forces created professional relationships that transcended ethnic divisions while preserving distinct tactical traditions that could complement each other in joint operations. Anglo-Saxon infantry techniques that emphasized disciplined formation fighting merged with Scandinavian expertise in rapid movement and surprise attack to create combined military capabilities that surpassed what either tradition could achieve independently. The exchange of tactical knowledge that resulted from these partnerships enhanced defensive effectiveness while creating personal bonds between warriors who had recently fought each other with deadly intent. And so we reach the end of our journey through 3 centuries that transformed the medieval world, where Scandinavian seafarers evolved from opportunistic raiders into the architects of new kingdoms and cultural syntheses that would echo through the corridors of history for millennia to come. The Viking Age, which began with the shock of Lindisfarne's destruction, concluded not with conquest or defeat, but with something far more remarkable: the peaceful integration of warrior cultures that created foundations for modern European civilization. As you drift towards sleep, let these final echoes of longships and treaty halls carry you into dreams of distant shores and ancient wisdom that continues shaping our world today.